something was always standing outside his door in Chicago. The first time the camera caught it, the hallway light outside his door had already gone dim, and the screen in the security office showed only a washed-out corridor with peeling paint, a crooked runner rug, and the narrow strip of shadow where apartment 12B began. Then something passed across the bottom of the frame. Not a person, not clearly, just a movement that bent the light for a second, as if someone tall had leaned close to the door and then withdrawn before the shape could fully form. By morning, the tenant had already filed another complaint. He had done that several times before. The management office kept them in a paper folder with the corners curling inward from use. Noise in the hallway after midnight, slow footsteps stopping outside his apartment. A soft knock with no one there when he looked through the peephole. Once, the written note said he had heard breathing. Not on the other side of the door exactly, but close enough to make the wood feel thin. The building manager had written the same answer more than once in the margin. No one observed, no evidence found. It was an old building on the north side of Chicago, one of those heavy brick apartment blocks raised when hallways were made narrow and ceilings were made high, as though the people who designed them expected the dark to settle overhead and stay there. The radiators hissed in winter like something irritated in the walls. The front vestibule smelled faintly of wet wool, rust, and old letters. Tenants came and went without speaking much. They shared elevators, laundry rooms, thin walls, and the private certainty that strange sounds were part of the place. No one remembered exactly when the complaints about the hallway began. Some said it started after a leak on the third floor, when the plaster had been opened and repaired and the corridor lights flickered for weeks afterward. Some said it had been happening for much longer, only no one had written it down before. But the tenant in apartment 12B, a quiet man in his late 30s who kept a regular schedule and rarely brought visitors upstairs, became the one who reported it most often. At first, he sounded embarrassed. He told the manager he knew how it would seem. Old building, pipes knocking, other tenants coming home late, he worked long hours, and maybe he was too tired. But he had begun waking a little after 3 o'clock in the morning to the feeling that someone was standing outside his door, not knocking, not moving, just waiting there. He said the feeling would drag him awake before any sound did. Then, after a minute or two, he would hear a soft scrape in the hall, like the sole of a shoe turning slowly in place. The manager checked more than once. Each time, the corridor was empty. Then, another tenant on the same floor mentioned it in passing near the mailboxes. She did not make it formal. She only said she had stepped out late one night to throw away a bag of trash and thought she saw someone standing at the far end of the hall, facing the wall beside apartment 12B. When the elevator opened behind her and she glanced back, the figure was gone. She laughed when she told it, but the laugh had a careful sound to it, as if she wanted the story to end before it had properly begun. After that, the complaints were taken a little more seriously. The manager reviewed the entrance logs. No forced entry, no sign of trespassing, no one sleeping in the stairwell. She asked the evening doorman whether he had seen anyone lingering on the floor. He said no. She reminded tenants not to let strangers inside. For a week or so, the building returned to its usual sounds. Footsteps, plumbing, doors closing gently at midnight, wind along the window seams. Then, the tenant in 12B called the emergency line for the building just before dawn and said someone had crouched outside his door long enough to block out the light underneath. When the manager arrived, he would not open right away. She heard the deadbolt turn, then the chain, then silence, then his voice asking whether she was alone. He looked gray and exhausted when he finally let her in. He had not slept. He pointed to the thin band of light at the bottom of the door and said it had gone dark for several seconds, then returned, then gone dark again, as if someone were shifting their feet inches away. He had checked the peephole, he said, and seen nothing but the warped yellow of the hallway bulb. Yet, while he stood there, a slow pressure came against the other side of the door. Not pounding, not enough to rattle the frame, just a steady, deliberate lean. The kind that made the metal chain give a little click against the wood. The manager found no one outside, but that morning she requested access to older security cameras stored in the basement office, including the one aimed at the far end of the 12th floor corridor. The camera had a poor angle. It could not see the full front of apartment 12B, only part of the hallway leading toward it and a wedge of wall opposite the door. The footage from most nights was useless. Empty corridor, flickering light, static bloom, the occasional tenant passing through with groceries or laundry. But on several nights, always in the same quiet hours, between deep night and first morning traffic, something interrupted the frame. It never appeared all at once. One clip showed the shadow arriving before anything else, long and narrow, stretching across the opposite wall as if cast by a body standing just out of view. But there was no visible source for it. Another clip showed what might have been the edge of a sleeve or the side of a coat, a dark vertical line entering the frame and then slipping back again in a motion too smooth to look natural. On another, the image grain rose sharply and a pale blur crossed close to the lens, followed by a faint tremor in the picture, though the hallway itself remained empty. The manager copied several clips to show the board. A maintenance worker watched them and said it was probably a camera fault. A resident on the second floor said maybe it was a prank. Someone else suggested a tenant avoiding the lens on purpose, but no one could explain why the movement never resolved into a full body, not even for a second. There were moments when the corridor brightness changed, moments when the rug seemed slightly depressed near the edge of the frame, moments when the door to 12B looked as though someone stood before it, but no person ever stepped completely into view. The tenant asked to move units. Management said nothing was available. He stopped sleeping in the bedroom after that. The bedroom wall shared a line with the hallway, and he said he could hear too much through it once he started listening. Not voices exactly, more like careful adjustments. Cloth brushing plaster, the faintest click near the brass numbers on the door. He began falling asleep on the couch with the television on low volume, then jerking awake each time the elevator cables sighed through the shaft. A week later, the woman across the hall noticed something else. Every morning, just outside 12B, the runner rug was slightly out of line. It was an old rug, thin from years of shoes and cartwheels, with a border pattern worn almost white. The building cleaner straightened it during the day. By the next morning, the far corner near his door would be bent back again, not by much, just enough to reveal a sliver of floor beneath. At first, it looked accidental. Then she realized it was always the same corner, always folded toward the door, as if someone standing there had worried the rug edge with the side of a shoe for a very long time. The tenant began placing a chair beneath the knob at night. He also taped a strip of thin paper across the crack between the door and the frame, low enough that it would tear if anyone pushed inward. In the mornings, the paper remained intact, but the tape was often puckered and loose, as though damp breath had gathered against it for hours. He showed this to the manager. She said the hallway was drafty. He did not argue. He only looked past her shoulder into the corridor while she spoke. His friends noticed the change in him before the building did. He missed calls. He stopped going out after work. He started having groceries delivered, then stopped answering the buzzer until the driver had gone and the lobby was quiet again. The circles under his eyes deepened. Once, while speaking to a coworker in the parking lot behind the office, he said he knew how it sounded, but whatever was outside the apartment seemed to know when he was awake. That was the first detail that made the story spread through the building. He had tested it, he said. One night, he left the television on and all the lamps lit, then sat just inside the bedroom doorway without moving. Nothing happened. Another night, he turned off every light, lay in bed fully dressed, and kept his eyes open in the dark. A little after 3 a.m., the sound came. One footstep, then another. Then the long stillness outside the door. When he rose and crossed the apartment, the sound on the other side shifted too, adjusting to his movement as though following the position of his body through the walls. The manager did not like hearing this from tenants in the lobby. She told people not to encourage rumors. The board was already tired of discussing the footage, and the building had enough ordinary problems without adding something shapeless to the list. Yet, even those who mocked it began hurrying slightly as they passed the 12th floor corridor at night. A delivery driver claimed the elevator had opened there once by itself, and he had seen, at the very end of the hall, a figure standing too close to one of the doors, head bent at an angle that did not look comfortable. Before the doors could part fully, the elevator had closed again. Winter tightened around the city, the windows in the stairwell frosted at the edges. Steam clanged through the old radiators. The tenant in 12B started spending weekends with his brother in another neighborhood, but he always returned for work, and each time he came back, he stood in the hallway before unlocking the apartment as though listening for something on the other side. One evening, he found a faint smear on the paint beside the peephole, gray and powdery, as if someone had rested a forehead there and left old dust behind. He wiped it away. The next morning, it had returned. A little lower. Management finally arranged for a second camera, this one installed farther down the hall to capture more of the doorway. The board wanted proof one way or the other. Trespasser, prank, defect, anything that could be named and fixed. The new camera was sharper, better lit, less forgiving. For 2 nights, it recorded nothing unusual. On the third night, a little after 3:40 a.m., the image changed. The hallway remained empty. The light over 12B hummed faintly. Then the sensor compensated, darkening the whole corridor for an instant, as though something had entered the frame without reflecting properly. When the brightness returned, there was a disturbance near the tenant's door. Not a body, more like a portion of one, a density that displaced the air. The brass numerals on the door became harder to see. The shadow line along the frame thickened. The rug corner slowly lifted, then settled. The most unsettling part came seconds later. The tenant opened the door from inside, only a few inches at first. The chain was on, a slice of warm apartment light cut into the hall. From the angle of the camera, his face was not visible, only one hand on the edge of the door and the pale rectangle of light widening. He seemed to look out. He did not move for several seconds. Then the door slammed shut so violently the camera shook. When management reviewed the footage with him the next day, he became agitated and said the video was wrong. He insisted he had not opened the door at all. According to him, he had stood in the dark with his hand near the knob, listening to something breathe softly on the other side, but he had never turned it. He said he would have remembered. The chain had still been in place when morning came, the chair had still been under the knob, yet there he was on the screen, opening the door to a hallway where no one could be seen. The board suggested stress, lack of sleep, a partial waking state. He stared at the paused image of his own hand in the doorway and said nothing. After that, he began covering the inside peephole with tape. He said he had started noticing movement in it before the sounds began, not outside the door, but inside the lens itself, like a blink where no eye should have been. When he removed the tape once to check, he found the outer glass fogged over from the hallway side. That should not have been possible in the dry winter air. He put the tape back and never took it off again. A few tenants moved out that season for unrelated reasons, but in the building's retelling, it all blurred together. A couple on the 10th floor left after a boiler issue. A graduate student on the 12th sublet her place after saying she was tired of the elevator stopping where she had not pressed it. Rumors stitched these things into one fabric. People began referring to the corridor outside 12B with a careful change of tone, the way neighbors sometimes speak around a subject they have already decided not to examine too closely. Then, the tenant vanished from the building for 3 nights in a row. Management assumed he had gone to his brother's place again. Packages accumulated in the lobby, his mailbox filled. On the 4th day, he reappeared looking calmer than anyone had seen him in weeks. He told the manager he had rented a hotel room downtown to sleep. He had spent 2 full nights there without interruption. No footsteps, no darkening under the door, no presence waiting in the hall. She asked why he had come back. He said, after a pause, that the last morning in the hotel, he had found a faint indentation in the carpet outside his room, right where someone might have stood for a long while without knocking. That afternoon, he gave notice. He packed over the next several days, always in daylight, with the apartment door propped open while friends carried out boxes. Nothing unusual happened then. The corridor looked ordinary. The air smelled faintly of bleach from a recent mopping. People passing by nodded, embarrassed perhaps by how relieved they were to see normal movement in that part of the floor. He handed back his keys before sunset and left the building without turning around. The unit remained vacant for nearly a month. During that time, the complaints stopped completely. No one heard footsteps outside the empty apartment. No camera captured any strange movement. The runner rug lay flat each morning. The manager allowed herself to think the whole thing had been a human problem after all. something centered on one exhausted tenant and an old building ready to echo whatever fear was brought into it. Then a new renter moved in. He was younger, stayed up late, worked from home, and knew nothing about the stories except that the building was cheap for the neighborhood and the hallway lights were unreliable. For the first week, everything seemed fine. On the 8th night, the security office recorded a brief disturbance near his door. Not much. Only a thinning of the image, like heat passing in front of glass. The next morning, he asked maintenance whether the floor outside his apartment had always been so cold. He said the boards near the threshold felt like stone through his socks, even when the radiators were hissing. No one told him the rest. The second complaint came 2 days later. He said someone had been standing outside late at night, maybe a neighbor, drunk or confused, but whenever he looked through the peephole, the hallway was empty. He laughed about it. He said the weird part was that he could still hear the floorboards answer tiny shifts of weight just beyond the door. By the end of the week, he had bought a small camera of his own and set it on a shelf facing the entryway from inside the apartment. The recording was later shared among tenants in fragments, passed phone to phone in the laundry room and in whispers near the mailboxes. Most of it showed nothing. A dim apartment, kitchen light off, living room washed with the glow of street lamps through blinds. Then, sometime deep in the night, the metal knob began to tremble so slightly the movement might have been missed if the viewer blinked. After that, the line of darkness beneath the door vanished, not all at once, but in sections, as if something outside were lowering itself very slowly until it lay flush against the wood. No sound came through the recording. The new tenant moved out before the month was over. Years passed and the building changed owners. The lobby was repainted, the old runner rugs were replaced. Cameras were upgraded again and again until the hallways looked too clear, too bright, stripped of the shadows that once helped stories survive. Some records were lost, some were thrown out. The folder of complaints was said to have disappeared during an office cleanout. Most people who still mention the story do so uncertainly, attaching it to different floors, different winters, different apartment numbers, but a few details remain stubborn. Tenant reports in the old building did describe repeated sightings in the hallway. Security footage did show movement outside one particular door without ever fully revealing a person. At least one resident is said to have opened the door on camera while later insisting he never touched it. And according to those who still lived there long enough to compare notes, whatever stood in the corridor was never seen arriving by elevator, never seen using the stairs, and never caught in full view under proper light. It was always at the edge of the frame, always where the camera could not quite finish its work. And in the oldest version of the story, the one repeated softly by a former tenant who claimed he heard it from the night doorman, there was one final detail that never made it into any complaint. On certain winter mornings, before the cleaners came through, the paint beside that door would carry a faint oval mark at the height of a human face, as though someone had been leaning there for hours in absolute stillness, listening to the breathing inside. When the building was renovated, that section of wall was sanded, primed, and painted over in a brighter color. New numbers went up, the old door was replaced. The hallway looked cleaner after that, more finished, less willing to hold a shadow. Even so, people in the neighborhood still tell a version of it when talk drifts toward old apartment buildings and the ways they keep things. They say the reports were probably misread. The footage was probably flawed. The tenant was probably overtired. The building was probably settling. Chicago has many old corridors, many old pipes, many doors thin enough to make anyone imagine a presence on the other side. Then someone usually mentions the camera problem. Not that it captured too little, but that it captured exactly as much as it was meant to. A hallway, a door, a light, a rug, an absence where no absence should have been. And if the story is told late enough, in a room where the windows shake softly with winter wind, someone will remember one more thing. After the first tenant left, according to those who claim to have seen the last copied footage before it vanished, the camera stayed on the empty hall for several minutes. Nothing moved. The light held steady. The corridor was blank. Then, very near the lens, a shape bent inward from above, as if something tall had been standing there the whole time, looking not at the door anymore, but directly into the camera, waiting for it to understand what it had missed. The silence of the Villisca house. The town of Villisca, Iowa, in the early summer of 1912 was a place defined by its predictability. It was a thriving agricultural hub, a tight-knit community where front doors were rarely locked, and the rhythm of life was dictated by the sun and the ringing of the church bell. On the surface, the evening of June 9th was no different from any other. The air was thick with the humid weight of a Midwestern summer, the kind of heat that lingers long after the sun has set, drawing insects to the warm glow of porch lamps. On East 2nd Street, a white two-story frame house sat quietly in the gathering dusk. It was the home of Josiah Moore, a successful local businessman, his wife Sarah, and their 4 young children. But on this particular Sunday, the house was not entirely empty. Even though the family was away, someone was already inside. The Moore family had spent the evening at the local Presbyterian church attending the annual Children's Day exercises. Sarah Moore had co-directed the program, and all of her children, 11-year-old Herman, 10-year-old Catherine, 7-year-old Boyd, and 5-year-old Paul had participated. They were accompanied by 2 neighborhood friends, 12-year-old Lena Stillinger and her 8-year-old sister Ina, who had been invited to spend the night. It was a joyous, exhausting evening of recitations and hymns. While the children sang in the crowded, brightly lit sanctuary, their home stood in deep shadow, silently harboring a trespasser. Police investigations would later reveal the chilling truth of those empty hours. Sometime during the late afternoon or early evening, while the house was unoccupied, a figure walked through the unlocked front door. They did not ransack the drawers or search for silver. They simply found a place to hide. They climbed the narrow stairs, maneuvering into the cramped, unfinished attic space located in the upper reaches of the house. The true horror of the Villisca tragedy does not merely lie in the bloodshed that followed, but in the agonizing, suffocating hours of anticipation. To understand the terror is to picture that dark, unventilated attic on a hot June night. The temperature under the sloping roof would have been stifling, the stagnant air thick with dust, and the smell of dry timber. Yet, the intruder remained completely still. They sat on the rough wooden joists, enveloped in absolute darkness, gripping a heavy axe. It was Josiah Moore's own axe, likely retrieved from the backyard before the killer slipped inside. 2 cigarette butts were later found near a slight depression in the floorboards, a quiet testament to the killer's unnerving patience. He sat there, smoking in the dark, listening and waiting. Around 9:30 p.m., the sound of footsteps on the front porch shattered the silence. The heavy wooden door swung open, letting in the warm night air and the overlapping voices of 6 tired, happy children. From the pitch blackness of the attic, the intruder could hear everything. The muffled thud of Sunday shoes being kicked off, the clinking of glass and porcelain as Sarah Moore served the children milk and a plate of cookies, the low, comforting murmur of Josiah's voice as he spoke to his wife. The floorboards of the Moore house were thin. To the man crouching in the attic, the family was painfully close. He could track their movements by the creaking wood beneath his feet. He listened as the children washed their faces, their laughter drifting up through the plaster ceiling. He listened as Josiah and Sarah moved about the parlor, performing the mundane, intimate rituals of closing up the house for the night. They felt entirely safe. They were completely unaware that death was suspended just inches above their heads, holding its breath. Slowly, the noises began to change. The energetic chatter faded into sleepy whispers. The 2 Stillinger girls, Lena and Ina, settled into the guest bed in the downstairs parlor. Josiah and Sarah climbed the stairs to their bedroom on the 2nd floor. The 4 more children went to their respective beds down the hall. The warm glow of the oil lamps was extinguished one by one, plunging the house into deep, heavy darkness. Now began the most agonizing phase of the killer's vigil. He did not strike immediately. He understood the delicate rhythm of human sleep. He knew that the initial descent into slumber is fragile, easily broken by a sudden creak or a shifting shadow, and so he waited in the suffocating heat of his hiding place. He waited for the house to cool down. He waited for the quiet rustling of cotton sheets to cease. He waited with a predator's discipline until the collective breathing of 8 people slowed, deepened, and fell into the steady, rhythmic cadence of profound, vulnerable sleep. Midnight passed. The town of Villisca was dead to the world. Inside the house on East 2nd Street, the silence was absolute, save for the soft sound of air filling sleeping lungs. In the attic, the unseen watcher finally moved. He gathered his weapon, he shifted his weight off the wooden joists, his muscles undoubtedly stiff from hours of motionless waiting. Slowly, meticulously, he descended the narrow attic stairs. The darkness of the house was absolute, but he moved with a chilling sense of purpose. He did not immediately go to the bedrooms. Instead, he engaged in a bizarre, methodical preparation that would baffle investigators for decades. He found pieces of clothing and linens in the dark. He draped them over the mirrors in the house. He hung cloth over the glass panels of the doors. He systematically covered every reflective surface, ensuring that neither he nor his victims would have to look upon the work he was about to do. He carried a heavy slab of iron and wood. The axe blade was sharp, but he turned it around in his hands, opting for the blunt, crushing flat of the axe head. He moved toward the master bedroom first. Josiah and Sarah Moore were deeply asleep. The killer approached Josiah's side of the bed. He raised the axe high above his head in the pitch-black room, the heavy iron catching whatever faint starlight bled through the drawn curtains. He brought it down with devastating force. He struck Josiah, then Sarah, moving with a fluid, mechanical rhythm that offered no chance for screams. The parents died in their beds, swallowed by the dark before they could even open their eyes to the nightmare. Leaving the master bedroom, the shadow moved down the hall. Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and Paul lay in their beds, their small chests rising and falling under their blankets. The killer moved from bed to bed. The heavy, wet thud of iron on bone was the only sound in the house. There was no struggle, there was no waking, just the relentless, sweeping arc of the axe in the suffocating blackness. 6 lives had been extinguished on the 2nd floor, but the intruder was not finished. He gripped the bloodied handle of the axe and descended the main staircase to the 1st floor. In the parlor, 12-year-old Lena and 8-year-old Ina Stillinger were asleep in the guest bed. Perhaps a loose floorboard creaked. Perhaps the heavy, sudden scent of copper in the air disturbed her. Investigators later found chilling evidence that Lena, the oldest of the children, might have briefly awakened in the dark. She was found lying crosswise on the bed, a defensive posture, a desperate and futile attempt to shield herself from the descending shadow. It was over in moments. With 8 bodies lying motionless in the dark, the killer's grim ritual continued. He moved through the silent rooms, taking pieces of clothing from the dressers. He carefully draped the garments over the ruined faces of his victims, hiding them from the world. He took a 2-pound slab of uncut bacon from the icebox in the kitchen and placed it on the floor in the guest bedroom alongside a piece of a keychain. He drew the window shades tight. He filled a bowl with water, washed his hands at the kitchen table, and left the bloody water behind. Finally, he locked the front door from the inside, took Josiah's keys, stepped out into the cool pre-dawn air, and vanished into the night. The morning of June 10th broke bright and clear. By 7 o'clock, the neighborhood was beginning to stir. Mary Peckham, an elderly woman who lived next door to the Moores, stepped out onto her porch to hang laundry. She noticed a strange, heavy stillness about the house next door. There were no children playing in the yard. The chickens had not been fed. The morning chores were entirely abandoned. The house was locked tight, the shades drawn all the way down to the sills. By 8 o'clock, her mild concern had turned to a gnawing dread. Mary called Josiah's brother, Ross Moore. Ross arrived shortly after with a spare key. He unlocked the front door and stepped into the dim, quiet parlor. The air inside was thick, smelling heavily of copper and voided bowels. He called out into the gloom. There was no answer. He pushed open the door to the downstairs guest room and saw the dark, rust-colored stains soaking through the bedsheets and the unnatural stillness of the 2 little girls. Ross Moore stumbled out of the house, his face ashen, and told Mary to call the marshal. Within hours, the entire town of Villisca would know that the unimaginable had happened. The house was descended upon by law enforcement, doctors, and a horrified, panic-stricken public. They found the covered mirrors, they found the basin of bloody water, they found the 8 bodies, completely unrecognizable, their faces shattered and hidden beneath bloody clothes. And when they finally climbed into the suffocating heat of the attic, they found the 2 cigarette butts. They found the slight depression in the dust where a man had sat for hours. Next story. The Friendly Stranger on the Trail. The Appalachian Trail stretches for over 2,000 miles, a continuous ribbon of dirt woven through the oldest mountains in North America. Hikers call it the Green Tunnel. In the spring, the canopy grows thick, choking out the sunlight and wrapping travelers in a perpetual damp twilight. There is a deep, primal silence there, broken only by the crunch of boots on leaves and the distant calls of unseen birds. It is a place where people go to find peace, to leave the noise of civilization behind. But that same isolation demands a heavy toll. Out in the deep woods, miles from the nearest paved road, you are completely cut off from the world. There are no police, there are no sirens. If you scream, the sound is swallowed by a million ancient trees. In this quiet void, a specific culture has evolved, one built entirely on implicit trust. Hikers rely on each other. They share food, they share shelter, and they trust the strangers they meet at the end of a long day of walking. It is a beautiful system, fragile as glass, and when that glass violently shatters, it leaves a jagged, bleeding wound that the forest never forgets. In May of 1981, the trail through Virginia was blooming with new life. Robert Mountford and Laura Ramsey were 27 years old, far from their home in Maine. They were social workers, people who dedicated their lives to helping troubled youth and the marginalized. Their hearts were open, their demeanors naturally kind and empathetic. Taking time away from the heavy emotional toll of their professions, they had set out to hike the Appalachian Trail. By the time they reached Giles County, Virginia, they had already walked for weeks. They were hardened to the physical demands of the trail, their legs strong, their heavy packs settled perfectly against their shoulders. They had fallen into the hypnotic, repetitive rhythm of the long-distance hiker, wake at dawn, walk through the morning mist, rest in the afternoon heat, and find a wooden shelter before sunset. They knew the unwritten rules of the woods, they knew how to read a topographic map, how to filter stream water, and how to spot a friendly face. The culture of the trail dictates that fellow hikers and locals who frequent the path are kindred spirits. There is a common term, trail magic, used to describe the unexpected acts of kindness bestowed upon weary travelers. A cold drink left by a trailhead, a lift into a resupply town, or a local offering a warm fire and conversation at a shelter. When Robert and Laura approached the Wapiti shelter in the Jefferson National Forest, the sun was beginning its slow descent behind the ridges. The shadows stretched long and thin across the dirt. It was late afternoon, perhaps around 5 o'clock. Their bodies ached for rest. The shelter was a simple, 3-sided wooden structure with a tin roof, a common sight along the trail, designed to offer a dry, elevated place to sleep. But they were not alone. A man was already sitting near the shelter. He looked like any other local who might wander up the mountain for a day of scouting or camping. He was young, in his late 20s, blending seamlessly into the rustic environment with his unkempt hair and rugged clothes. His name was Randall Lee Smith. At first glance, there was nothing remarkable or threatening about him. He greeted Robert and Laura with the familiar, easygoing charm that hikers expect from rural Virginians. He knew the woods intimately. He knew the trails. He offered them the kind of casual, soft-spoken conversation that eases the fatigue of a 20-mile day. Robert and Laura dropped their heavy packs, their muscles sighing in relief. They set out their foam sleeping pads and pulled out their small brass camp stoves to boil water for dinner. The atmosphere was light and welcoming. They shared the small dirt clearing with Smith, treating him with the same open-hearted trust they offered to everyone they met on their journey. They exchanged stories. They talked about the weather, the steep conditions of the path ahead, the quiet beauty of the surrounding forest. Smith listened, nodding, smiling softly at their anecdotes. He played the part of the friendly trail angel to absolute perfection. As the light faded from the sky and the cold, damp air of the mountain evening settled over the camp, the three of them sat near the shelter. The woods grew dark, transitioning into the kind of absolute, suffocating blackness that only exists miles away from electric lights. The only illumination came from the faint glow of the stars through the leaves and the beam of a single flashlight. Then, the atmosphere in the camp began to shift. It was not a sudden explosion of violence, but a slow, agonizing drop in the psychological temperature. The casual conversation naturally ebbed as the night deepened, but the silence that followed was not the comfortable, heavy-lidded quiet of tired travelers. It was taut, it was expectant. Robert and Laura, highly attuned to human behavior through their years of social work, might have felt the first subtle prickle of unease on the back of their necks. The friendly local was no longer making small talk. He was no longer looking at the trees or the dirt. He was just sitting, watching them. The horror of the Wapiti shelter did not begin with a shout or a sudden lunge. It began with the slow, deliberate death of a smile. The amiable, easygoing mask that Randall Lee Smith wore began to slip away, muscle by muscle. The warmth vanished entirely from his eyes, leaving behind a stare as cold, flat, and empty as a frozen lake. He was looking at Robert and Laura not as fellow human beings, not as interesting travelers from out of state, but as objects. The physical transformation in his posture was complete, and it was utterly terrifying. The realization of what was happening would have washed over the young couple like freezing water. They were not sharing a camp with a trail angel. They were trapped in a cage of trees with a predator. The silence of the deep woods suddenly turned deeply hostile. The chirping of the night insects sounded like a mocking chorus. The closest paved road was miles away over rough terrain. The nearest town was nothing but a distant rumor. There was no cell phone service in 1981, no handheld radios, no panic button to press. Every survival instinct they possessed was screaming that the man sitting just feet away from them was a lethal threat, but there was nowhere to run. The Appalachian Trail is treacherous at night, a twisting, narrow path of slippery roots and jagged rocks that would easily break an ankle in the pitch black. They were pinned down in the open front of the three-sided shelter, utterly exposed to the dark and to the man sitting in it. When Smith finally produced a weapon, the illusion of safety was permanently and violently shattered. The friendly stranger who had shared their evening, who had listened to their stories of Maine, who had smiled at their jokes, was now holding their lives in his hands. It is the ultimate paralyzing nightmare of the wilderness, the profound, unfathomable betrayal of trust. To look into the face of someone you just shared bread with, only to find a hollow, emotionless void looking back at you. He had played a game with them. He had sat patiently, waiting for the sun to disappear, waiting for them to take off their heavy boots, waiting for them to become completely physically and mentally vulnerable. The extreme isolation of the forest, once a source of deep spiritual comfort for the hikers, became an inescapable, suffocating trap. The ancient trees stood as silent, indifferent witnesses to the slow, methodical cruelty that was about to unfold. Robert Mountford and Laura Ramsey never walked out of the Jefferson National Forest. Their journey of self-discovery ended brutally in the dirt and wet leaves of Giles County. Robert was shot point blank. Laura fought desperately for her life, a frantic struggle in the dark woods, but was ultimately bludgeoned and stabbed to death. Smith dragged their bodies into the brush and buried them in shallow graves near the shelter, leaving their grieving families and the entire hiking community in a state of sheer devastation. When their remains were finally discovered days later, the inherent innocence of the Appalachian Trail was fractured beyond repair. The murders sent a permanent shockwave of paranoia through the tight-knit community of long-distance backpackers. The sacred, unwritten law of implicit trust had been violently violated, Decades later, the ghost of that betrayal still haunts the long green tunnel. The original Wapiti shelter was eventually dismantled, torn down piece by piece to erase the physical reminder of the nightmare, but the mountain soil there retains the heavy memory. Every hiker who walks through the dense, darkening woods of Virginia must eventually grapple with a chilling knowledge. The greatest danger in the wild is not the black bears, nor the freezing weather, nor the treacherous rocky terrain. The true horror is the realization that a warm smile can be a hunting tactic, and that miles from the safety of civilization, the friendly stranger on the trail might just be waiting for the sun to go down. The night the 911 operator hung up first. By the time the operator understood that the caller was answering too late, the line had already gone quiet once, then opened again on its own with a soft scrape, as if the receiver had been lifted by a hand that did not know what a telephone was supposed to sound like. The county dispatch room sat behind the sheriff's office in a low building of painted cinder block with one narrow window facing a gravel lot and the black outline of the hills beyond. At that hour, there was only one operator on duty, a woman who had worked the night shift long enough to know the different silences of the county. There was the silence of winter roads after midnight, when even the logging trucks were gone. There was the silence that came before a domestic call, when breathing filled the line but nobody wanted to speak first. And there was the silence of open land, old houses, and telephone wires stretched across hollows where the dark seemed to collect and stay. The call that came in just after 3 o'clock in the morning did not match any of those. The first part of the recording, according to later reports, was incomplete. The county's equipment was old even then, and pieces of incoming audio were known to drop out or distort. What survived began with the operator identifying the line and asking what the emergency was. For a few seconds, there was nothing but a faint rushing sound. Then, a man's voice, distant and thinned by static, said that he needed help. The operator asked him to repeat himself. There was another delay. Then, in the same voice, a little closer this time, he said that something was outside his house. It would not have been unusual by itself. In that part of West Virginia, people called for bears in the yard, strangers on porches, headlights lingering too long at the end of a drive. The operator asked for the address. What made the call strange was not the fear in the man's voice, but the pattern. Each time she asked a question, there was a pause just a little too long to sound natural, followed by an answer that seemed to come not from someone thinking, but from someone listening first. Not to her, to something else. She asked for the address again. A long hush followed. The tape held a faint clicking, not unlike an extension line being lifted somewhere else in the house. Then the man said, carefully, as if repeating words fed to him, that he was at the old route house beyond the creek crossing near the county line. The operator knew the place only vaguely. Rural callers often gave directions instead of house numbers. She asked for a name. Another pause. This time, the answer came wrong. The voice gave the address again, almost word for word, but slower. The operator corrected him, asked again for his name, and when the reply came, it arrived with the same soft delay as if it had crossed a room before entering the mouth that spoke it. According to people who later heard the recording, that was the moment her tone changed. It did not break, she did not panic, but the steadiness flattened. She began speaking more distinctly, as operators are trained to do with frightened callers, and she asked whether the man was alone in the house. The tape carried a low shuffling sound. A hinge moved somewhere. The caller did not answer at first. Then he whispered that he thought so. Outside the dispatch room, nothing moved. The sheriff's deputies were covering a wide area that night, one on a traffic stop near the highway and another farther south on a welfare check. The operator started one unit toward the caller's area, then kept the man talking as best she could. She asked what he could hear. The caller said there had been knocking at the back door for almost an hour. Not loud, not trying to get in, only patient. 3 taps. Then nothing, then 3 taps again. He said his dogs had gone under the kitchen table and would not come out. The operator asked whether he could lock himself in a room. The delay came again. Then the man said, in the same careful tone, that he had already done that. It should have reassured her. It did the opposite. The room sound on the call did not match a closed bedroom or a bathroom. Even through the poor quality of the tape, there was an openness to it, the soft hollow of a larger space. She asked which room he was in. There was no answer. Then, faintly, another voice could be heard. People disagree about that part. Some later said it was only feedback or the warble of bad equipment. Others believed there were two people on the line, one farther from the receiver. The surviving audio is not clear enough to prove either version. But several who reviewed the report said the operator reacted as though she heard something she could not place because she stopped speaking for a moment, then asked very quietly whether anyone else was in the room with him. Nothing. Static. A single, dull tap. Then the man answered no. A deputy reached the road nearest the property several minutes later and radioed that the house sat back from the lane at the end of a washed-out drive with no outside lights on. The operator relayed this to the caller, telling him help was almost there. For the first time, the voice on the line seemed to respond without the strange delay. It said thank you immediately with such abrupt relief that she must have felt some easing in her chest. Then, after a pause, the voice added that something had just moved in the hallway. What followed is one of the details repeated most often in retellings of the incident. The operator told the caller not to leave the room, not to make any noise, and to stay on the line. The tape captured a slow creaking sound that might have been floorboards or the receiver shifting in a hand gone damp with sweat. Then there came a series of very soft knocks. Not from the back door, not distant, close. So close that the sound seemed to come through the telephone itself. 3 taps. A pause. 3 taps again. The operator spoke the caller's name, or what she believed was his name from an earlier garbled exchange. There was no answer. Instead, she heard breathing, but it no longer sounded frightened. It sounded measured, curious, the kind of breath someone takes while listening through a wall. The deputy outside radioed that he was approaching the porch. The operator told the caller deputies were entering the property. The line stayed open. In the recording, a new noise emerged then, one that investigators later described only as movement near the mouthpiece. Cloth brushing plastic, a fingernail or ring striking the handset once. Then the man's voice returned, but farther away than before. So far away, it seemed to come from the end of a hall. It said, with that same odd care, do not let them knock. The operator asked what he meant. The voice did not answer. The deputy, now at the door, reported no lights, no response, and no sign of forced entry. The operator told him the caller might be hiding inside. She stayed on the line and asked the man if he could hear the deputy outside. This time, the delay was longer than any before, long enough that she repeated the question. Then the voice said yes. But the deputy radioed at that same moment that he had not knocked yet. After that, the surviving record becomes more confused. One report says the operator asked the caller whether he could see whoever was outside his room. Another says she asked whether there was a second phone in the house. Either way, what matters is that the answer came back before she had finished speaking, not after. It arrived on top of her words in a low murmur, as though whatever was listening had finally learned the timing. Witnesses later claimed that the operator pulled the headset slightly away from one ear at that moment. She would not discuss it in detail afterward. All she ever admitted was that she became certain, for reasons she could not cleanly explain, that the man who had placed the call was no longer the one speaking to her. Whether that belief came from the pacing of the responses, the change in breathing, or the simple animal feeling that something had shifted on the line, nobody could say. The deputy entered through an unlocked back door. He swept the kitchen first. 2 dogs were found under the table, pressed so far back against the wall that he had to crouch to see their eyes. A chair had been overturned near the sink. The phone on the kitchen wall hung in its cradle. The cord was still untouched. There was no one in the room, no obvious sign that a call had been made from there. The operator heard him moving from room to room over the radio, while the line in her headset remained open, full of soft breathing and the faintest scrape, as if the caller were dragging one finger across wallpaper. The deputy checked a sitting room, then a narrow hallway, then the front room facing the road. No one. He reported a damp footprint on the hall floor, but only one. too smeared to judge clearly and odd in shape. Before the operator could ask more, the voice on her line spoke again. It asked whether the deputy was alone. She did not answer. Later, according to coworkers, she said the question felt less like fear and more like appetite. The training manuals on her desk, the illuminated buttons, the buzzing fluorescent light overhead, all the ordinary objects around her began to seem very far away. She pressed her hand against the edge of the console to steady herself and told the deputy to exit the house immediately. He demanded a reason. She did not give one. She only repeated the order, sharper this time. By then, the second deputy had arrived outside. The first deputy began backing toward the kitchen. As he moved, he radioed that one bedroom door at the end of the hall was shut. He said he had not opened it yet because he thought he heard movement inside. The operator closed her eyes for one brief second. When she spoke again, she told him not to open it. The deputy asked why. She said she had the caller on the line, and the caller was not in that room. Nobody ever produced a perfectly satisfying explanation for what happened next. The first deputy ignored her and opened the bedroom door. Inside, according to official notes, the room was empty except for a bed, a lamp, and a small table with a second telephone lying on its side. The line to that phone had been cut, not recently, but sometime before, the copper darkened, the outer sheath dry with dust. On the bedspread, close to the pillow, was an impression deep enough to suggest weight had rested there for a long while. The window above the bed stood open to the black yard behind the house. And from the dispatcher's headset, all at once, there came the sound of knocking again. Not 3 taps this time. 1. Then another, heavier, resonant, and close, like a fist striking wood from the inside. The operator tore the headset off. That was the part people remembered, because operators did not do that. They were trained to stay with a caller through almost anything. But she let the headset fall against the console, and the room microphone picked up enough of the open line for others nearby to hear a voice continuing to speak from the earpiece. Not loudly, not clearly. Just enough to make the hair rise along the necks of the people who later described it. No suspect was found on the property, no caller was identified with certainty. The house belonged, according to county records, to an elderly man who had died some months earlier, though neighbors reportedly claimed a relative came and went from time to time. Some said they had seen a light in the place within the last week. Others insisted it had been empty much longer than that. The available reports do not settle the question. The audio itself remained incomplete, with segments missing at the beginning and end, and some portions badly degraded. What did enter local memory, and stay there, was not the paperwork, but the pattern. The operator had received a call from a house where no working phone appeared to have placed it. She had spoken to a man whose identity could not be pinned down. She had realized, before the deputies did, that the voice answering her questions was changing. And at the moment when trained instinct should have kept her calm and connected, she had done the one thing dispatchers were not supposed to do. She hung up first. Afterwards, she worked only day shifts for a while. Then, not long after, she left the county job entirely. People who knew her said she never liked to discuss the case, though one former coworker remembered her saying that what frightened her was not the possibility of a prank or even a person hiding in the house. It was the delay. The voice always seemed to wait, she said, as though someone else in the room had to hear the question before the answer could be given. In the hills, stories rarely stay fixed. They gather weather and rumor. By the time the tale had traveled through diners, porches, gas stations, and late kitchen conversations, it had changed shape the way all local legends do. Some said the caller had been dead before the phone ever rang. Some said there had been a prowler moving through abandoned houses, lifting receivers, and listening to people breathe. Some said the open bedroom window faced a patch of ground where no grass had grown right for years. And some claimed that on damp nights, if the lines were bad and the county was quiet, dispatchers still heard an extra click before certain calls connected, like someone in another room picking up an extension and saying nothing. None of that was ever proved. But in rural counties, proof does not always kill a story. Sometimes the uncertainty feeds it. A deputy who later retired told the story only once in public, at a civic supper, and even then he avoided the worst parts. He said the thing he remembered most was not the bedroom, or the cut phone line, or the dogs under the table. It was stepping back onto the porch after searching the house and seeing the operator's patrol lights spill across the yard while all the woods beyond remained perfectly still. No wind, no insects. No movement in the trees, just that stillness, deep and watchful, as if the hillside itself had been listening to the call. Years later, people still argued over the details. They argued about the missing seconds on the tape, about whether there had truly been a second voice, about whether the house was occupied, about whether the operator's instincts had saved a deputy from walking deeper into something human or something worse. Those arguments never resolved anything. They only kept the story breathing. And the last part, the quietest part, lingered longest. When the supervisor reviewed the damaged recording near dawn, after the deputies had cleared the scene and the sun had not yet reached the valley, there was almost nothing left at the end. Just static, a faint shift of plastic against a desk, and the soft click of the operator disconnecting the line. Then, beneath it, so faint it could easily have been tape noise, there seemed to be one final sound. Not a voice. Not exactly. More like someone very close to the mouthpiece, learning how to whisper after the call was already over. The Unlocked Door, the Sacramento Vampire. There is a profound fragility to the concept of home. We surround ourselves with walls of plaster and wood, arrange our furniture, and fill the space with the soft light of television screens and the quiet hum of refrigerators. We convince ourselves that the perimeter is secure. But the boundary between the absolute safety of a living room and the vast, unpredictable darkness of the outside world relies almost entirely on a single piece of metal. A deadbolt, a latch, a simple twist of the wrist before bed. In the sleepy, sun-baked suburbs of Sacramento, California, in the winter of 1977, that illusion of safety was shattered forever. The residents of those quiet neighborhoods would soon learn that a door is only a barrier if you remember to lock it. If you forget, it becomes something else entirely. It becomes an invitation. To understand the creeping dread that paralyzed the city during the early weeks of 1978, one must understand the twisted logic of the man walking its streets. Richard Trenton Chase was fundamentally broken, his mind consumed by severe paranoid schizophrenia. He did not live in the same reality as the families settling down for dinner behind their suburban windows. Chase was haunted by somatic delusions of the most horrifying nature. He believed with absolute and terrifying certainty that his heart was shrinking. He believed his own blood was turning into a dry, useless powder. In his decaying mind, the only cure, the only way to keep his own heart beating, was to consume the fresh blood and organs of others. He began with the neighborhood animals, leaving a trail of mutilated pets and gruesome remains in the quiet canyons and empty lots. But as his illness deepened, the animals were no longer enough to satisfy the frantic, paranoid demands of his failing body. The shadow that was Richard Chase began to turn his hollow eyes toward the houses, towards the people living inside them. And as he walked the sidewalks in a filthy, oversized orange ski parka, his pockets heavy with a .22 caliber pistol and a butcher knife, he operated under a very specific, deeply ingrained delusion regarding the rules of entry. To Chase, a locked door was an insurmountable barrier. It was a clear, undeniable statement of rejection. If he walked up to a porch, gripped the brass handle, and found it held fast by a lock, he would simply let go and walk away. He believed that the locked door meant he was not welcome there. But an unlocked door held a completely different meaning. In the fractured, magical thinking of his mind, an unlocked door was not an oversight. It was not a neighbor taking out the trash, or a teenager running to the car, or a tired mother simply forgetting to turn the deadbolt after carrying groceries inside. To Richard Chase, an unlocked door was an open, willful invitation to enter. Imagine the sheer horror of this delusion applied to the mundane reality of everyday life. You are sitting in your favorite chair. The evening news is murmuring on the television. The hallway is bathed in the warm, yellow glow of a reading lamp. You are relaxed, defenseless, wearing your comfortable clothes, entirely enveloped in the sanctuary of your own home. You hear the faint, metallic click of the front doorknob turning. You do not panic. Your mind rationalizes the sound instantly. It must be your husband returning from his shift or your roommate coming back from the store. You do not even turn your head as the heavy wooden door swings open on its hinges. But the footsteps that cross the threshold are too heavy. The breathing is ragged, wet, and frantic. And when you finally look up, it is not a loved one standing in your foyer. It is a hollow-eyed stranger, his clothes stiff with dried, dark stains, casually stepping into your sanctuary with a butcher knife in his hand, looking at you not with malice, but with the cold, calculated entitlement of an invited guest. This nightmare became reality on the 23rd of January, 1978. Teresa Wallen, a 22-year-old woman who was 3 months pregnant, was enjoying a quiet morning in her home. The sun was up, the neighborhood was awake. It was the kind of ordinary morning that promises nothing but routine. Teresa had briefly stepped out to empty the garbage, a chore so mundane it barely registers in the memory. When she stepped back inside, she closed the front door behind her. But she did not lock it. Why would she? It was broad daylight. She was safe in her own home. Moments later, Richard Chase walked up her driveway. He approached the front door. He reached out with pale, trembling fingers and tested the handle. The latch clicked. The door gave way. The invitation was accepted. The details of what occurred inside the Wallen home over the next hour are a descent into profound, unspeakable darkness. Chase did not sneak in. He simply entered. When he encountered Teresa, there was no hesitation. He shot her fatally, and then the true horror of his pathology was unleashed. He utilized the butcher knife he brought with him, acting with the frantic, messy desperation of a starving man at a banquet. He harvested what he believed he needed to survive. He bathed in her blood. He drank from her, using a yogurt cup he found in her own kitchen, turning the mundane objects of her domestic life into tools of his gruesome ritual. When her husband returned home later that afternoon, he did not just find his wife dead, he found his sanctuary violated, transformed into an abattoir, all because the front door had been left unlatched. The terror in Sacramento escalated with blinding speed. Just 4 days later, on the 27th of January, the invitation was extended again. Less than a mile away, another door was left unlocked. This time, it was the home of 38-year-old Evelyn Myroth. Inside the house with her were her friend Dan Meredith, her 6-year-old nephew Jason Sorois, and her 22-month-old nephew Baby David. 4 people going about their day behind a door that someone had forgotten to secure. Chase tested the knob. It turned. The nightmare walked in from the daylight. Dan Meredith was in the hallway when the front door opened. Chase shot him in the head at close range, stepping over his body to move deeper into the house. The violence that followed was methodical and devastating. He found Evelyn and young Jason in the bedroom. The walls of the suburban home echoed with the sharp cracks of the .22 caliber pistol, quickly muffled by the heavy silence that followed. Once again, Chase engaged in his horrific post-mortem rituals upon Evelyn, his mind driving him to consume, to take, to sustain his own fading existence with their vital fluids. The quiet of the neighborhood outside remained entirely undisturbed. The mail was delivered, cars drove past. No one knew that behind the unlocked door, a monster was tearing a family apart. When Chase finally left the Myroth house, he did not leave empty-handed. He carried the lifeless body of baby David with him, slipping back out into the mundane world as easily as he had entered it. The baby's remains would not be found for months, discarded in a vacant lot, another casualty of the open door. The aftermath of the discoveries paralyzed the region. The Sacramento Police Department, seasoned detectives who had seen the worst of human nature, were physically ill at the crime scenes. The sheer brutality, the senselessness of it, defied all conventional investigative logic. There was no forced entry, no shattered glass, no splintered door frames. The killer was walking through the front door like a ghost. When the media released the details that the killer was entering unlocked homes, a wave of visceral panic washed over the city. Hardware stores sold out of deadbolts, chain locks, and window latches in a matter of hours. Gun sales skyrocketed. People adopted large, aggressive dogs. The warm, trusting culture of the California suburbs evaporated overnight. Neighbors looked at neighbors with suspicion, but mostly people looked at their own doors. The nightly routine of checking the locks became an obsessive, terrified ritual. Husbands and wives would check the deadbolt twice, 3 times, unable to shake the image of the hollow-eyed man walking into their hallway. The fear was no longer about the dark alleys or the bad parts of town. The fear was sitting in the living room, staring at the brass handle, wondering if it was turned all the way. Law enforcement eventually caught Richard Chase. Through a combination of eyewitness accounts of the man in the orange parka, footprint analysis, and sheer investigative legwork, they traced the horror back to his apartment. When detectives breached his door, a door he ironically kept locked, they found a space that mirrored the absolute decay of his mind. The apartment was a slaughterhouse. Blood stained the walls, the floors, the kitchen utensils. They found blenders slick with human remains. They found a calendar where he had marked the dates of his hunt. The evidence of his madness was absolute and undeniable. Chase was institutionalized, tried, and eventually died in his cell from an overdose of hoarded medication, a pathetic end to a terrifying existence. But the death of the Sacramento vampire did not erase the psychological scar he left behind. The true horror of Richard Chase is not just the gruesome nature of his crimes, nor the tragic loss of 6 innocent lives. The true horror lies in the terrible, fragile line between safety and slaughter. He proved that the monsters do not always have to break the glass or bash down the wood to get to you. Sometimes they just walk down your quiet street, walk up your concrete steps, and place their hand on your doorknob. They wait for that one momentary lapse in judgment. That one night you are too tired to get off the couch. That one afternoon you are just running out to the garbage can for 5 seconds. They wait for the soft metallic click that tells them the barrier is gone. They wait for the invitation. Every night at 3:17, someone knocked in Cedar Rapids. The first knock came while the house was already awake. It was not loud. That was what the woman remembered later, when she tried to explain why she had not called anyone the first night or the second. It was too measured for panic, too polite for danger. 3 slow strikes against the front door, each one spaced evenly, as if a visitor stood on the porch with one gloved hand raised in the dark, certain that sooner or later someone inside would answer. When she looked at the clock on the stove, the green numbers had just changed to 3:17 a.m. By the time she reached the little pane of glass beside the door, the porch was empty. The street beyond it was empty too. The houses along the block were dark, their windows black and shut, their yards silvered faintly by a weak street lamp at the corner. There had been no footsteps on the steps, no car engine, no shape moving away across the lawn. Only the cold white reflection of her own face in the glass, and the sense that whoever had knocked had done it with complete confidence, as though the silence afterward mattered more than the sound itself. The next night, it happened again. 3 knocks, the same careful rhythm, the same time. Her husband sat up in bed before the third one landed. He had heard it too. This time, he went to the door immediately, flicking on the porch light as he moved, opening it fast enough to catch anyone who might have been hiding close to the frame. But the porch was bare. The steps were bare, the sidewalk was bare. A little wind moved through the dry leaves gathered under the hedge, and somewhere farther down the street, a dog began barking in a nervous, strangled way, then cut itself off all at once. In the morning, they found nothing on the porch. No prank, no sign of forced entry, no footprints in the damp strip of dirt near the flower bed. The husband walked the perimeter of the house, checking the windows, the alley, the detached garage. Everything was shut, everything was still. After 4 nights, the woman mentioned it to a neighbor, expecting embarrassment on her own face as she spoke. Instead, she saw recognition. The neighbor did not answer right away. He stood with one hand on his trash bin, looking past her toward the row of houses, as if choosing whether to say what he knew. Then he asked what time it happened. When she told him, he let go of the bin slowly. According to later accounts, that was the first time anyone on the block understood the complaints were not separate. One family on the next street had heard knocking at 3:17 a.m. for nearly 2 weeks and had assumed it was teenagers. An older man living alone had reported the same thing a month earlier, though by then the police had found no one on his property and no damage to the house. A renter 3 blocks away claimed the knocks had started after the house next door was vacated and continued even after the power was shut off inside it. None of the reports sounded serious by daylight. They became serious only when spoken together. Soon, people were waking before the sound came. Some sat in darkened living rooms and stared at their front doors from across the room, waiting for the hour to turn. Some watched from upstairs windows where they could see the porch and the sidewalk at once. One man on the corner kept his truck idling in the driveway, headlights pointed straight at the front steps. Another left a floodlight burning all night over the front walk. But the pattern did not change. At 3:17 a.m., there would come that same restrained knocking from the front entrance. Never frantic, never hurried, never repeated after the first set. Whoever heard it and rushed outside found nothing. The strangest report came from a woman who had moved out for a week to stay with her sister. She had not wanted to sleep in the house anymore. Her youngest son had begun waking before the knocks, sitting up in bed and whispering that someone was standing on the porch without a face. The boy was too young, in her view, to understand how to frighten adults properly, and that made it worse. So she packed clothes, took the children, and left the place empty. Her husband stayed elsewhere as well. No one remained inside the house. A neighbor across the street told police that the knocking still came. Night after night, at the same time, 3 measured strikes on the front door of a house that no longer held anyone at all. It should have ended there, in that category of quiet local disturbances that never become anything larger. A prankster could not be caught. A prowler could not be identified. There were no injuries, no broken locks, no theft, no body lying in a yard, only sound, only repetition. The kind of thing that turns into rumor because rumor is easier to hold than an unanswered fact. But then people began noticing details that did not belong together. One resident later said, the knocks never sounded like knuckles on wood. He had assumed they did, because what else could they be? Yet once he sat close enough to the entryway to hear them from inside the front room, he thought the sound was wrong. Too hollow, perhaps, or too flat, as if whatever struck the door had no give to it. Another said the sound seemed to come from shoulder height, then chest height, then lower, though always on the same door. A retired carpenter on the block told neighbors that the front panel on his door carried the vibrations strangely, almost as if the impact landed on the outside and the inside at once. Several people began leaving powder on their porches. Flour, mostly, sometimes ash from fireplaces. One man spread a clean layer of dust from the edge of the welcome mat all the way to the top step, hoping to catch shoe prints. In the morning, the powder remained smooth, untouched, except for the thin score where the door had swung open after the knocks and the family had rushed out again. No footprints approached. No footprints left. According to local retellings, one household set a chair directly against the inside of the front door and waited with the father seated in it, hand pressed to the wood. The knocks came on schedule. He leaped back afterward and told his wife, with a face that had gone pale in a way she had never seen before, that he had heard the sound clearly but felt nothing touch the door at all. Autumn came in slowly, flattening the lawns and turning the trees brittle around the edges. The neighborhood learned the hour by instinct. Lamps burned later than they used to. Window curtains remained cracked just enough for one suspicious eye. In daylight, people laughed at themselves because daylight demanded it. They discussed raccoons, pipes, branches, settling wood, bored teenagers, some trick of distance that made a sound from elsewhere land on a front porch. Yet every explanation broke on the same fact. The knocking happened at 3:17 a.m., in the same rhythm, under too many different conditions, whether the houses were occupied or empty, lit or dark, watched or unwatched. One of the houses had been empty long enough to begin looking blind. The grass had gone coarse around the foundation. Circular marks from flower pots remained on the porch where nothing sat anymore. The front window had a paper notice folded against the glass from the inside, pale and unreadable from the street. Local residents later disagreed over whether that house had ever received the knocks before it was vacated or only after. But more than one person claimed that if they stood outside at the right angle after midnight, they could see movement behind the front curtains even though the power was off and the place had been cleared. A patrol car was sent more than once. Officers found quiet streets, locked doors, tired homeowners standing barefoot on front walks in robes and coats, each one embarrassed to be there. Official responses, insofar as anyone remembered them, were practical and brief. There was no suspect, no evidence of attempted entry, no sign anyone had been on the property. Disturbance complaints were taken, noted, and folded into the ordinary paper drift of city life. But one story remained, repeated years afterward in lowered voices, because it attached itself to a uniform and therefore sounded more solid than the rest. The story said that one officer arrived just before the hour and parked with his headlights off halfway down the block. He waited in the car where he could see two front porches at once. At 3:17 a.m., he heard the knocks. He was certain of that. 3 even blows. He also saw, or believed he saw, that neither porch light changed, no door opened, no person stood on either set of steps. The sound seemed to arrive without a source. He drove up at once, checked the yards, and found the street completely empty. Years later, depending on who told it, the officer either requested no more overnight calls to that block or laughed the matter off and refused to discuss it. Stories like that tend to harden where facts are thin. The woman from the first house began sleeping in the back room. It changed nothing. The knocking still reached her, muted by distance but exact in its timing. One night, after weeks of poor sleep, she made a decision that embarrassed her even in the moment. She moved quietly through the dark house, unlocked the front door, and opened it a few inches before the hour, leaving the chain latched so the porch showed only as a slim column of night. She wanted to prove something to herself. If there was a prankster, the open crack would reveal movement. If there was someone standing close to the frame, they might speak. If it was all imagination, then the empty porch might settle the matter once and for all. The house stood in silence around her. A refrigerator motor clicked on and off. Somewhere, a board shifted faintly in the hallway. From outside came nothing at all. Then, at 3:17 a.m., the door moved under the chain. Not inward by much, not enough to throw metal hard against metal. Just a careful pressure from the other side, as if someone had placed a hand against the edge and discovered, with mild surprise, that it was already open. The woman later said she heard no knock that night, only that pressure, only the slow testing of the door, followed by stillness so complete she could hear her own pulse in her ears. She slammed it shut and woke her husband in tears he had no way to comfort. After that, other sounds entered the reports. A faint tread on front steps after the knocks, though no one was seen. A whisper outside the storm door that could not be made out. The scrape of something along the porch railing. One family found their wind chime hanging perfectly still after the sound, even though the trees overhead were moving in a steady breeze. Another found the brass knocker on their door warm to the touch, though they swore no one had used it. The most unsettling detail did not come from the porches at all, it came from inside. More than one witness later claimed that on nights when the knocking was heard, a second sound followed several moments later from deeper in the house. Not always, not in every house, but enough times to survive in retelling. A floorboard shifting in an empty upstairs room, a closet door easing against its frame, the soft impact of something settling in a hallway where no one stood. It was as though the sound at the front door was not asking to be let in, but announcing that something had already crossed the threshold by another route. By early winter, the block had changed its habits. People visited less after dark. Children were called indoors before evening fully set. The ordinary courtesy of neighborhood life thinned into tired nods and half-finished conversations in driveways. A few residents began keeping radios on through the night, low and steady, just to disturb the silence before the hour arrived. It did not help. The knocking came through radio static as easily as through stillness. Then, as abruptly as it had begun, it stopped. For several nights, there was nothing. Then a week, then two. People did not trust the absence at first. They waited awake, then drowsing, then sleeping again. Porch lights went dark earlier, curtains were left open, the neighborhood loosened. Some said the cold had driven away whoever had been responsible. Some said the police had frightened off a prankster at last. Others did not offer theories. They only enjoyed the relief. The empty house remained empty through that stretch of quiet. Snow gathered shallowly along the walk and froze there in gray ridges. Circular drifts formed around the porch posts. The paper in the front window had yellowed more at the edges. One evening, a real estate worker came by to inspect the property before a sale and left after less than 20 minutes, though the weather was clear and there was still light enough to work. No reason was given. The lockbox stayed on the rail for a while after that, bumping lightly in the wind. When the new occupants finally arrived, neighbors watched from behind their curtains. A man and a woman, not old, with a rented truck and the tired, brittle cheerfulness of people trying to turn a strange house into a chosen one. They brought in boxes, lamps, kitchen chairs, a rolled rug, a mattress. The porch light burned warm above them. Several nearby residents considered crossing the street to say something. None of them did. Warning someone about a rumor requires believing it enough to sound foolish in another person's face. The first night passed without incident. The second night passed too. On the third morning, the woman from the original house woke before dawn to a sound she had hoped never to hear again. 3 slow knocks. Exact. Measured, unmistakable. She sat upright in bed, unable to breathe for a moment because the sound had not come from her own door this time. It had come from across the street, from the house that had stood empty through all those weeks of silence. According to what neighbors later pieced together, the new occupants had heard the knocking at 3:17 a.m. and assumed someone needed help. The man went downstairs while his wife stayed in the hall above. He opened the door. She heard him say nothing, or perhaps only a single word spoken too softly to carry. Then she heard the storm door close again. When she came down to the entryway, he was gone. His boots were still on the mat. His coat still hung over the banister. The front door was shut, but not locked. There were no footprints leading away from the porch, except the marks left later by police and neighbors searching the yard. No one on the block reported seeing a person crossing the street, entering a car, or moving through the alley. The man was simply no longer in the house. Searches were made. Questions were asked. The story spread beyond the neighborhood then, because a disappearance has weight that a sound does not. Yet, even in that larger telling, certainty remained difficult. Some said the man had a reason to leave and chose the hour for his own purposes. Some insisted there must have been evidence not shared publicly. Some rejected the link entirely, claiming frightened neighbors had sewn 2 unrelated events together into a legend. It is possible they were right. But local memory kept the order of things intact. The months of disturbance complaints, the empty porches, the watched houses, the exact time, the knocks continuing even when no one was home. And at the center of it, the feeling shared by those who heard them that the sound was never random, never testing, never confused. It was the sound of arrival. Years later, people on that side of Cedar Rapids still avoided certain kinds of silence. A few of the old houses were renovated, some were sold, families came and went, children grew up and left the block, carrying only fragments of the story with them. New owners often knew nothing about the complaints unless someone chose to tell them. Even then, the details changed from mouth to mouth. 3 knocks became 4, then returned to 3. The season shifted depending on the teller. The empty house moved 1 street over. That is the ordinary erosion of memory. Yet one detail survived with unusual strength, not because it could be proven, but because too many people repeated it exactly. Now and then, in the last dark stretch before dawn, a resident would wake for no clear reason and look at the clock, 3:17 a.m. Then would come that old, helpless stillness, the sense of a whole neighborhood holding its breath. On rare nights, someone still claimed to hear the knocks, not always on their own door, sometimes faint and far off, as if heard through several houses at once. 3 patient blows. Then nothing. No one ever agreed on what would happen if a person opened the door quickly enough, or left it open before the sound arrived, or chose not to move at all. Theories survive because they are never tested in the one way that matters. The woman who first heard the knocking kept living in Cedar Rapids for years, but she never again stood waiting at the entryway before the hour. She slept with a lamp on in the back room and kept a chair beneath the knob until she moved away. The house where the man vanished changed hands more than once. In photographs taken during later listings, the front porch looks ordinary. 2 posts, narrow steps, a plain door with a small pane beside it that reflects the street. There is nothing in those images to suggest the place ever held more than routine unhappiness, more than the usual weathering of Midwestern winters and summers. Still, people who know the story tend to notice the same thing when they look too long. The porch appears as if someone has just stepped out of frame. And if the picture is viewed late enough at night, when the room behind the viewer has gone quiet and the glass begins to give back a faint reflection of the watcher's own face, there is sometimes the brief, absurd impression that another shape is standing closer to the door than it should be, waiting with one hand raised, patient as ever, for the minute to come around again. A Scottish Highlands account described a figure that made no sound. The rain was striking the tin roof of the isolated shelter with the force of handfuls of gravel, making it impossible to hear anything else, which was why the absolute silence of the figure outside felt so deeply wrong. It was exactly 11:45 p.m. when the lone hiker first noticed the dark silhouette moving past the single, cracked window of the stone bothy. The wind sweeping across the barren moorland was strong enough to bend the ancient heather flat against the earth, creating a constant, roaring rush of noise. Yet the tall shape walking just 30 feet away from the glass stood perfectly straight. Its heavy, ragged coat hung motionless around its knees, entirely undisturbed by the gale, as if the entity existed in a completely different physical space, untouched by the violent weather of the world around it. According to the account filed weeks later by an American traveler who had been mapping a remote section of the Scottish Highlands, the strange encounter took place in late October of 2019. He had hiked nearly 14 miles that day, navigating treacherous bogs and steep inclines before seeking refuge in a small, ancient stone structure known only to local shepherds and experienced trekkers. He had secured the heavy wooden door with a rusted iron latch at around 6 in the evening, grateful to escape the rapidly dropping temperature and the creeping gray fog. He had built a small fire in the narrow hearth, drinking bitter tea and reading by the dim light of a single battery-powered lantern. The extreme isolation of the moors was supposed to bring peace, but as he stared out into the darkness that night, he realized he was entirely cut off from the rest of the world, with no cellular service for at least 20 miles in any direction. At first, the traveler desperately tried to rationalize the sight through the window. He reasoned that his exhausted mind was simply playing tricks on him, perhaps projecting the vague shape of a lost stag or a trick of the flickering firelight onto the thick fog rolling outside. But the dark figure did not dissolve into the mist. It took deliberate, impossibly smooth steps through the thick, sucking mud that surrounded the shelter. The hiker slowly leaned closer to the cold glass, using his sleeve to wipe away a layer of condensation. He watched in growing dread as the entity abruptly stopped walking. It turned its upper body slowly, facing the window with a jerky, unnatural motion. The ambient orange light from the indoor fire was barely enough to illuminate the yard, but it was just enough to reveal that the figure was much too tall to be a human being. It stood easily 7 feet high, its limbs unnaturally thin, dangling loosely and motionlessly at its sides. The most unnerving detail, according to the official report he later gave, was the complete lack of physical interaction between the entity and its environment. The Highlands in late autumn are famously hostile and raw. The rain was driving in almost sideways, pooling in deep, treacherous puddles across the peat bog. Yet, as the tall figure shifted its weight and took another step toward the bothy, it made absolutely no splash. The heavy, dark shapes that looked like wrapped feet did not sink into the soft mud. It moved with a gliding, mechanical precision, appearing to float just a fraction of an inch above the saturated ground. The hiker held his breath, pressing his back flat against the rough stone wall beside the window. He realized with a cold certainty that whatever was out there was not fighting the severe storm, but completely ignoring it. 10 minutes passed in agonizing, suffocating suspense. The hiker crouched in the dark, having carefully reached over to switch off his lantern so he could not be easily seen from the outside. The only light remaining in the small room was the dying, pulsing glow of the embers in the hearth. He listened desperately for the sound of heavy boots on the stone step outside, or the metallic rattle of the iron latch on the door. There was only the deafening roar of the wind and the endless drumming of the rain. The sheer volume of the storm should have been comforting, acting as a natural barrier between him and the dark, but instead, it felt blinding. If the silent entity decided to break down the door, the hiker knew he would not hear it coming until the old wood splintered inward. A sudden, aggressive drop in temperature forced the hiker to pull his thick wool jacket tighter around his chest. The air inside the small stone shelter turned bitterly cold in a matter of seconds, dropping so fast that his breath plumed in thick, pale clouds before his face. He slowly turned his head, inch by inch, to look back at the small square of the window. The tall figure was no longer standing out in the muddy yard. It was directly on the other side of the glass. The hiker felt his stomach drop, his heart hammering wildly against his ribs. The entity was so close that its broad, dark shoulders blocked out the storm entirely, filling the entire frame of the window with the texture of its heavy, damp-looking garments. It slowly pressed its face toward the glass. The hiker could not move, paralyzed by a deeply primal terror that locked his muscles in place. The face looking in from the storm was entirely devoid of distinct human features. There were no eyes, no discernible mouth, no brow ridge, just a smooth, pale expanse of skin that looked like worn gray leather stretched tightly over an irregular skull. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the entity raised a long, impossibly thin arm. It pressed a single, elongated hand against the outside of the windowpane. There was no tap of bone, no squeak of wet skin sliding on glass. The absolute dead silence of the gesture made it infinitely more terrifying. As the pale, featureless hand rested against the pane, a thick layer of white frost bloomed rapidly across the window, radiating outward from where the long fingers touched, completely freezing the glass from the outside in until the gray face was entirely obscured by ice. The hiker retreated backward on his hands and knees to the furthest, darkest corner of the room. He gripped a heavy piece of split firewood in his trembling hands, raising it to his chest, and waited for the frozen glass to shatter. He waited for the heavy wooden door to be violently forced open. He sat completely rigid in the freezing darkness for the rest of the night, tracking the agonizing passage of time only by the slow creeping of pale gray light that eventually signaled the arrival of dawn. The furious storm had finally passed, replaced by a dense, quiet morning mist that blanketed the moors. The inside of the bothy was deathly still. At precisely 7:15 a.m., the hiker finally found the courage to stand up. His joints ached terribly from the severe cold and the hours of sustained tension. He approached the door, his throat dry and his hands still shaking. The iron latch was still securely in place exactly as he had left it. The door had not been tested or pushed. The hiker grabbed the handle and shoved it open, wincing at the loud, sharp creak of the rusted hinges, a sound that felt deafening after a long night of straining to hear the impossible. He stepped out into the crisp, biting cold of the Highlands morning. The ground all around the shelter was a thick, muddy paste from the heavy overnight rainfall. He walked carefully around to the side of the stone building, dreading what he might find, to inspect the area directly beneath the single window. According to the statements he would later provide to a skeptical desk officer in a town 40 miles away, there were absolutely no footprints in the mud. There was no sign that a tall, heavy figure had stood there just hours before. There was only one strange disruption in the bleak landscape. Directly beneath the heavily frosted window, the wet grass and muddy peat had been completely replaced by a perfect circle of dry, dead earth, roughly 3 feet in diameter. The soil inside the tight circle was cracked, brittle, and gray, looking as though it had been drained of all moisture and flash-frozen centuries ago. The American traveler went back inside, quickly packed his bag, and left the area entirely, hiking for 9 straight hours without looking back over his shoulder. While local authorities formally dismissed the event as a case of extreme exhaustion and isolation-induced hallucination, older residents in the nearby villages simply nodded when they heard the whispered description. They rarely spoke of the deep moors at night, but when they did, they quietly mentioned that the most dangerous things hunting in the dark are always the ones that never make a sound. The phone that rang without a caller in Seattle. The first call came while the house was still settling into the cold, and by the time Margaret reached the hallway table, the telephone had already stopped. It left behind only the faint click of the line going dead and the uneasy hush that follows a sound too sudden for an old place. She stood there in her robe, one hand on the receiver, listening to nothing. No dial tone at first, only a thin rush, like distant air moving through a long pipe, and under it something so brief she almost mistook it for memory, a woman drawing breath to speak. The home stood on a steep street north of the Ship Canal in a part of Seattle where the older houses leaned into the weather as if still bracing against another winter from another century. It had a high front porch, narrow stairs, and a second-floor hallway that kept its darkness even at noon. According to the woman who sold it, the place had belonged to the same family for decades. According to a neighbor who spoke in a lowered voice over a fence slick with rain, strange calls had been reported there before. Not threatening calls, not obscene ones. Only rings in the middle of the night, and when someone answered, a silence full of faint movement. The neighbor had smiled after saying it, as if embarrassed by the shape of his own story, but he did not take it back. Margaret had moved in alone after her husband died. She was not old enough to be called elderly by anyone polite, but grief had a way of making a person move more quietly through rooms, as if careful not to disturb someone still sleeping. The house suited that quiet. It held sound in odd ways. The radiators sighed. The pipes tapped behind the plaster. The cedar outside the bedroom window dragged its branches across the siding whenever the wind shifted in from the water. She had begun to learn each noise by character and by hour. The ring of the telephone was different. It cut through the house with an urgency that made the air itself seem to tighten. The second call came 3 nights later, a little after 3 o'clock in the morning. This time, she answered before the ringing finished. She expected the usual confusion of a wrong number, some tired voice asking for a stranger. Instead, she heard a room. That was the first thing she thought later when she tried to describe it. Not a voice, a room, background noise with walls around it, something hard and echoing. Footsteps or shoes striking a smooth floor. Then a burst of crackling sound, as if another receiver somewhere had been lifted in haste. She said hello twice. No one answered her. But from far away, with the flattened distance of old recordings and bad lines, came a man speaking too quickly to make out. Then a woman, sharp and frightened, saying there was smoke. Margaret froze with the receiver pressed so tightly to her ear that the skin went numb. The line went dead before she could hear anything more. In daylight, the memory seemed thinner, easier to dismiss. Seattle mornings had a way of washing the terror out of things, replacing it with wet roofs, gulls, buses working uphill, and the ordinary business of people carrying coffee beneath umbrellas. Margaret told herself that crossed lines still happened. Old systems glitched, strangers called emergency services every hour of every day. Somewhere, somehow, 2 moments had brushed against each other through copper and rain. Then she mentioned it to the telephone company, and the technician who came to inspect the line spent a long time in the basement with a flashlight and a spool of wire, then came back upstairs with a face too careful to be reassuring. The wiring, he said, had been altered many years earlier, then altered again, and some of it no longer matched the usual pattern for a house of that age. There had once been an extension in the upstairs back bedroom, one that no longer existed except for a dead cable inside the wall. He asked if she had other instruments connected. She told him there was only the phone in the hall. He nodded, but his gaze drifted for a moment toward the staircase, as if listening for something above them. The next week, the calls began to settle into a pattern. Not every night, never at the same hour. They arrived during heavy rain, or in the wind before dawn, or in the narrow stillness just after midnight when the house seemed to hold its breath. Sometimes no one was there at all. Sometimes she heard fragments of noise, a dispatcher asking for an address, clipped and calm, the squeal of tires, a child crying somewhere far back in the line. Once, unmistakably, the hollow clang of a stretcher striking a doorway. Each call ended before it yielded enough to become clear. Each one left behind a feeling worse than fear, recognition without memory. Margaret began keeping a notebook beside the telephone. She wrote down the time of each call in words, the weather, and whatever she thought she had heard. After the 7th call, she noticed something strange. The sound seemed old, not old in content, because distress does not age, but old in texture. There was a grain to the voices, a muffled distance, an uneven hum beneath them, the faint metallic hiss of analog tape. She had listened to enough archived broadcasts and museum recordings to know the sound of a voice carried forward from another decade. The telephone, new enough to look ordinary, was delivering voices that seemed to belong to other equipment entirely. It was the neighbor again who told her what had happened on the street years before. He did not know the exact date. He spoke of it the way people speak of accidents that are folded into a neighborhood and remain there, half as fact, half as warning. There had been a fire in one of the older homes nearby long before most of the current residents arrived. A winter fire, he thought, started late at night, a family trapped upstairs. People in neighboring houses had phoned for help. Some said the fire crews reached the street quickly and were delayed by ice on the steep grade. Some said they were too late from the start. He could not say which house it had been, only that it was one of the old ones and that the story changed depending on who told it. He seemed relieved, after sharing that much, to drift into safer topics. Roof repairs, property taxes, moss. Margaret said nothing about the calls, but that evening she walked the 2nd floor with a flashlight, pausing outside each closed door. The back bedroom had been empty since she moved in, except for sealed boxes and an iron bed frame left by the previous owner. It smelled of dry plaster and cedar. The window looked over the alley and the dark slope beyond it. Against the far wall, behind stacked cartons, she found a square patch in the wallpaper where something had once been mounted and later removed. Below it, close to the baseboard, a narrow hole in the plaster had been filled badly and painted over. When she pressed her thumb to it, the wall gave a little hollow behind the surface. The dead extension line, she thought. The next call came while she was standing in that room. She heard the telephone ring downstairs. Once, twice, then a 3rd time, and with it came another sound, so soft she would have missed it if she had moved. Inside the wall beside her, something gave a tiny electric cheer. Not a ring, not exactly. The faint mechanical stir of an instrument attempting to wake. Margaret did not run. Later, she would wonder why. She simply turned her head and stood looking at the patched wall while the downstairs phone continued its urgent ringing below. The sound in the wall came again, a frail companion to the stronger peal downstairs, as though a second telephone, buried behind plaster and paint, were trying to answer from inside the house. When she lifted the receiver in the hall, the line was already alive. A man was breathing hard, not speaking, breathing the way people do when they are trying not to cough. Then came a woman's voice, raw and far away, saying there was someone still upstairs. Margaret felt the blood leave her hands. She said hello, and her own voice sounded flat and foolish against the depth of panic on the line. There was a burst of static. Another voice, calm, official, asking how many were inside. The woman answered, but the words blurred in a wash of crackle, then sharpened for just a second into one phrase. The back room. Margaret put the receiver down with such care it seemed she was lowering a sleeping child. The following afternoon, she went to the public library and sat beneath the soft heat of green-shaded lamps while rain darkened the windows. Old newspaper archives, neighborhood clippings, municipal records. It took hours. Much of what she found was incomplete. Addresses had been abbreviated or omitted. Fires in older parts of Seattle were common enough in the record to blur together. But there was one account, brief and yellowed in reproduction, about a house fire on a steep residential street north of downtown. A call for help had been placed shortly after midnight. One adult had escaped. Others had not. The report did not name the room where they were found. It did mention that telephone service in the house had continued to function for some unknown interval during the fire. A detail so strange the reporter had framed it almost as an aside. Several neighbors, the clipping said, later claimed they heard the phone ringing inside the burning structure even after firefighters entered. The clipping gave no more than that, and Margaret told herself she should have felt relieved. There was a real event beneath the story. A documented accident distorted over the years by repetition and superstition. But relief did not come. The more solid the old fire became, the worse the calls seemed. It was no longer a matter of imagination drifting through empty rooms. There had been a night. There had been voices. Somewhere in Seattle's older web of switchboards, operators, rewired homes, storm-damaged lines, and remembered tragedy, a thread had not fully broken. She stopped sleeping well. She found herself listening during the day for the ring that never came until dark. She unplugged the telephone one evening and sat in the living room with a book she did not read, watching the cord coiled on the floor. Near midnight, a small sound came from the hallway table. Not a ring, only the brittle little twitch of current moving through old metal. Then, from upstairs, the faint buried trill inside the wall. By morning, she had plugged the phone back in. A week later, the power failed during a windstorm. The entire block dropped into darkness at once, windows going black up and down the street as branches thrashed overhead. Margaret lit candles and waited for the house to settle. Without electric hum, the rooms felt deeper. The rain scraped the panes like handfuls of sand. Somewhere, a car alarm cried out once, then stopped. She was halfway up the staircase with a candle in hand when the telephone rang below. In the dark, it sounded much louder than it ever had before. She stood there on the stairs and let it ring 4 times. 5. On the 6th ring, she went down, set the candle in a saucer on the hall table, and answered. The line opened onto confusion so immediate it felt less like hearing than stepping through a door. Voices over voices, orders shouted at a distance, the high pulsing whine of equipment, then the unmistakable clipped tone of an emergency operator asking for the address again. Not once, again. Someone was sobbing too hard to answer, someone else was shouting that the stairs were gone. Margaret pressed the receiver to her ear until the plastic creaked. Through the layers of sound, another noise emerged, slow and hideous in its intimacy. A telephone ringing somewhere beyond the voices. Not the one in her hand. Another one. Another room. Another part of the same house. She lifted her eyes toward the staircase. At the top, beyond the banister, the second-floor hallway was dark except for a diluted square of streetlight filtering through the back window. In that gray strip of light stood a figure no darker than the hall around it, and for one moment, Margaret thought it was a coat hanging from a door. Then it moved. Not toward her, only enough to turn its head, as if listening down the stairs to the ring in her hand. The line went dead. She left the house before dawn and spent the rest of the night in a hotel near the water where the carpet smelled faintly of bleach and the walls were thin enough to let in the sounds of strangers arriving late. Even there, she woke twice, convinced a telephone was ringing in the room. By daylight, she almost believed she had imagined the figure. Exhaustion could do that. Grief could do more. But when she returned home, the candle saucer was still on the hall table, and on the second floor, the back bedroom door, which she knew she had left open, now stood shut. Margaret did not open it immediately. She made tea first, she stood at the sink and watched rain climb the glass in silver threads. Only when the kettle had gone silent did she carry her cup upstairs and place her hand on the knob. The room beyond was unchanged at first glance. Boxes, iron frame, window gray with weather. Then she saw the wallpaper debris on the floor by the far wall. A square section had come loose in the night. Behind it sat a shallow cavity between studs, and within that cavity, fixed to old wood, blackened at the edges as if by heat long ago, was a telephone cradle without a handset. The cord had been cut decades earlier. The metal hooks were rusted. Beneath them, clinging to the wood, hung a small paper tag browned nearly to illegibility. On it, in faded handwriting, was a single note. "Do not answer after the ringing stops." Margaret read it twice. There was no signature, nothing to suggest when it had been written or by whom, yet it felt less like a warning left for future owners than a rule discovered too late by someone who had needed the house to keep one last boundary. She stepped back until the bed frame touched her knees. For 3 nights, she obeyed the note. When the telephone rang downstairs, she let it ring out. Sometimes it stopped after a handful of chimes, sometimes it rang long enough to seem angry. Each time, after silence returned, she listened for the weak, hidden stir inside the wall upstairs. It always came a few seconds later. A second chance, perhaps. Or a second caller. On the 4th night, curiosity overcame fear in the patient way curiosity often does, not as courage, but as weariness. The call came just before midnight. Rain ticked against the windows. The house felt taut from roof to foundation. Margaret waited in the dark hall while the phone rang. Once, twice, 3 times, 4. Then it stopped. The silence afterward was larger than the ringing had been. From the back bedroom wall came the frail, buried trill. Margaret climbed the stairs. She moved with one hand on the banister, feeling the smooth, worn wood beneath her palm. At the end of the hallway, the bedroom door was open, though she had closed it earlier. Inside, the cavity in the wall seemed blacker than the rest of the room. The hidden telephone cradle could not ring, and yet the sound continued from within the plaster, a thin, insistent trembling. Margaret stepped close enough to smell old dust and damp paper. Then, from the darkness inside the wall, a voice began to speak. It was not loud, it was not even clear at first, only a murmur under static, so faint she had to lean in until her forehead nearly touched the cracked plaster edge. The voice was female, strained and breathless. It sounded less like a ghost than like a recording surviving badly. It said there was smoke. It gave part of an address that Margaret could not make herself hear twice. Then it said something else, a phrase almost lost under the hiss. "He is still on the stairs." Margaret stepped back so quickly she struck the bed frame. At the bedroom doorway stood a man in a dark coat wet with rain that did not seem to drip. His face was impossible to hold in focus, as if the dim room refused to keep it. He was not burned, he was not ruined. He only looked like someone interrupted while trying to reach another room. One hand was lifted slightly from his side, not reaching for her, not beckoning, only caught in the unfinished motion of a person climbing in darkness toward a ringing phone. Then the entire room filled with the smell of cold smoke. Not fresh fire, old smoke. Smoke that had soaked itself into beams and horsehair plaster and forgotten curtains and never fully left. Margaret put out a sound so small it barely counted as breath. When she looked again, the doorway was empty. Downstairs, the hallway telephone began to ring once more. She did not live in the house much longer. According to neighbors, she moved before spring had fully come in, leaving some furniture behind and refusing to discuss the sale. The place stood empty for a season, then changed hands. Over time, the story thinned and spread, as such stories do. Some said an owner discovered old fire damage hidden behind renovated walls. Some said the city records never matched the address cleanly because streets shift in memory faster than they do on maps. Some insisted there had been no fire in that house at all, only nearby, and that the entire legend grew from crossed lines and anxious people listening too hard at night. Yet, the rumor remained, tied not to the building itself, but to the telephone. People on that stretch of hill, especially in the older homes, still mention odd rings during storms. A call with no number displayed, a line that opens onto confusion already in progress, footsteps, dispatchers, voices asking for the address again, most hang up at once. A few keep listening long enough to hear what sounds like another telephone ringing farther in, deeper in the house than any room should allow. And one detail survives in nearly every version, though no one agrees where it began. If the ringing stops before the call is answered, it is better to let the silence remain. Because according to the oldest version of the story, the second ring does not come from the telephone in the hall. It comes from the room where someone never made it out. Montana Rangers logged the same signal for several nights. The hiss of the radio broke at exactly 3:12 a.m., replaced by a wet, heavy sound that did not belong on the emergency frequency. It was not the snap of static, nor was it the sharp tone of an accidental microphone click. It sounded like something large breathing slowly into a receiver, accompanied by the faint, rhythmic crunch of snow under heavy boots. The transmission lasted for 40 seconds before fading back into the white noise of Channel 6. In the isolated watchtower of Station 4, perched high above a vast, frozen expanse of Montana wilderness, the duty ranger simply sat in the dark and listened. The wilderness in late November was a place of absolute isolation. The tourist season had ended months ago, and the deep valleys were already buried under several feet of early winter snow. Only a skeletal crew remained to monitor the high ridges connected to the outside world by a daisy chain of radio repeaters bolted to the freezing peaks. The nearest paved road was 45 miles away. If something went wrong, help was at least a day's journey by snowmobile. The ranger on duty noted the strange transmission in the nightly logbook, marking it down as a phantom signal caused by atmospheric bouncing, a common enough occurrence in the high mountains. But the following night, at exactly 3:12 a.m., the radio cracked open again. The static dropped away instantly, leaving a dead, empty channel. Then the breathing returned. It was louder this time, closer to the microphone, wet and ragged, dragging in the cold air with a slow, deliberate rhythm. Behind the breathing, there was the same steady crunching sound. Something walking through deep snow. The ranger reached for the handset, his thumb hovering over the transmission button, but training held him back. You did not speak into a blind emergency channel unless someone requested aid. He listened as the footsteps seemed to grow louder, as if whoever held the radio was marching steadily toward the microphone itself. By the third night, a deep unease had settled heavily into the watchtower. The ranger had contacted Station 9, located across the valley on the southern ridge, to ask if they had been logging the midnight interference. The operator at Station 9 confirmed the reports. They had heard it too. According to their directional logs, the signal was not bouncing off the upper atmosphere. It was originating from deep within the Blackwood Basin, a densely forested ravine that had been completely inaccessible since the first major blizzard in October. There were no hiking trails down there, no logging roads, and certainly no power sources for a radio transmitter. Yet, the signal was strong, cutting through the high ridge winds with absolute clarity. The Rangers decided to triangulate the broadcast if it happened again. At 3:10 a.m., both men sat by their respective consoles, the green glow of the dials illuminating their small, frost-covered windows. At precisely 3:12 a.m., the squelch broke. The ragged, wet breathing filled both cabins simultaneously. But this time, the footsteps stopped. The deep, agonizing breaths continued for 10 seconds, and then a voice spoke. It was not a human voice. It sounded like a tape recorder playing backwards, a strange, metallic distortion that tried to mimic the cadence of human speech without forming actual words. It was a chaotic string of vowels strung together in a hollow, mocking tone. The ranger at Station 4 keyed his microphone. He broke protocol, stating that this was an official channel and instructing the broadcaster to identify themselves. The strange voice stopped immediately. The breathing returned for a few seconds, followed by the heavy click of the transmission ending. The radio went back to hissing static. Across the valley, the operator at Station 9 came over the internal frequency, his voice tight with tension. He had locked onto the origin point of the signal. It was indeed coming from the bottom of the Blackwood Basin, But there was a glaring problem. The signal had originated from an area where the timber was so thick, even a tracked vehicle could not pass through. The next morning, the ranger at Station 4 began digging through the archival logbooks stored in the metal cabinets beneath the main desk. He was looking for any history of strange radio balance in the basin, any old repeater stations that might have been abandoned and somehow powered back on. He pulled a dusty binder from 1994. As he turned the brittle pages, his finger stopped on a handwritten entry dated November 12, 1994. The duty officer at the time had logged an unknown transmission at 3:12 a.m. The notes described heavy breathing, the sound of footsteps in snow, and a voice that sounded broken and artificial. According to the old log, the 1994 transmissions had continued for 6 consecutive nights. On the 7th night, the duty ranger had requested a search and rescue flyover of the Blackwood Basin, convinced someone was lost and slowly freezing to death while clutching an open radio. The flyover was conducted the following afternoon. The helicopters found nothing but unbroken snow. No tracks, no camps, no signs of life. But the ranger who had written the log never returned for his next shift. The record stated he had resigned abruptly, leaving his gear in the tower and hiking down the mountain alone. The sun set early that evening, casting long, bruised shadows across the snowfields. The wind picked up, rattling the thick glass of the watchtower windows. The ranger at Station 4 made sure the heavy deadbolt on the reinforced wooden door was thrown entirely shut. He stoked the small wood stove, trying to push the damp cold out of the small room, but a strange chill seemed to radiate from the radio console itself. He sat in the low light, watching the digital clock slowly cycle toward 3 a.m. Across the valley, Station 9 was completely silent. The radio check-in at midnight had been brief, both men too on edge to make small talk. 3:12 a.m. arrived. The radio remained silent. The ranger let out a slow breath, thinking perhaps the atmospheric conditions had finally shifted, burying whatever ghost signal was haunting the valley. Then, at 3:14 a.m., the radio clicked. It did not hiss. It simply opened into dead, silent air. There was no breathing this time. No footsteps crunching in the deep snow. There was only the faint, echoing sound of wind blowing through pine trees, captured by a microphone somewhere out in the dark. Then the voice spoke, but it was not the distorted, chaotic string of vowels from the night before. It was a voice the ranger recognized instantly. It was his own. The radio played back his exact transmission from the previous night, down to the slight hesitation and the static pop of the button. The recording played back into the quiet room. This is an official channel. Identify yourself. The playback sounded hollow, stripped of all warmth, as if it were echoing out of a deep canyon. The ranger stared at the speaker, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had not recorded that transmission. There was no tape deck in the tower. The playback ended, and the open air returned. Then his voice played again. This is an official channel. Identify yourself. Only this time, the words were stretched, the pitch dropping lower and lower until it sounded like a heavy, mechanical groan. The words twisted into a slow, rhythmic distortion that mimicked the wet breathing from the first night. Whatever was down in the valley had not just been making noise, it had been learning. The internal frequency buzzed. It was Station 9. The operator's voice was barely a whisper. He told the ranger at Station 4 to look at the triangulation data. The ranger glanced at the secondary monitor. The blinking green dot, representing the origin of the unknown signal, was no longer resting at the bottom of the Blackwood Basin. It was moving. It was ascending the steep western ridge. It was moving straight up the incline through the dense, impassable timber, heading directly towards Station 4. The ranger watched the screen in silent horror. The dot was moving at an impossible speed. No human could climb a 40-degree incline through waist-deep snow in the dark. A snowmobile would have been loud enough to hear across the valley, and it could not navigate the tightly packed pines. Yet the signal marched steadily upward, covering hundreds of feet every minute. The open radio channel continued to broadcast the sound of the wind, but now the heavy, wet breathing had returned. It was louder, faster, matching the pace of something climbing relentlessly toward the summit. The wind outside the tower suddenly died down, leaving an oppressive, suffocating silence around the glass cabin. The only sound in the world was the dreadful, rhythmic breathing pouring from the radio speaker. The ranger backed away from the console, moving toward the center of the room. He realized that the breathing on the radio was no longer accompanied by the sound of crunching snow. The footsteps had stopped. The transmission was perfectly clear now, entirely free of static. The green dot on the monitor blinked one last time, resting precisely on the coordinates of Station 4, before the screen went completely black. The radio channel remained open. The breathing was so loud it rattled the small plastic casing of the speaker. It sounded wet and hungry, echoing in the confined space of the watchtower. The ranger stood frozen, staring at the reinforced door. Slowly, over the sound of the broadcast, he heard a physical noise outside the cabin. It was the heavy, distinct squeak of weight pressing down on the wooden planks of the exterior catwalk. Something had just stepped onto the deck that wrapped around the tower. The breathing on the radio stopped. At the exact same moment, something pressed itself against the heavy glass of the north-facing window. The ranger turned his head slowly. The security lights outside had burned out hours ago, leaving the deck in absolute darkness. But in the faint green glow of the radio dials, he could see a shape blocking the stars. It was tall, too tall to be a man, its silhouette hunched over the glass. A thick, pale mist began to form on the outside of the window pane, condensing as whatever stood there exhaled slowly against the freezing glass. The radio squelch snapped violently, emitting a high-pitched screech of feedback that forced the ranger to cover his ears. The sound was deafening, a localized blast of interference that shattered the quiet of the room. He squeezed his eyes shut, waiting for the glass to break, waiting for the door to splinter inward. The feedback wailed for 10 agonizing seconds before abruptly cutting out. The radio clicked off. The power to the console died. The watchtower was plunged into absolute pitch-black silence. When the morning sun finally broke over the eastern ridge, casting a brilliant, blinding light across the snowfields, the relief crew from the lowlands tried to raise Station 4 for the daily check-in. There was no response. After 2 hours of silence, a tracked vehicle was dispatched up the logging road to investigate. They found the watchtower securely locked from the inside. The wood stove was completely cold. The radio console had been entirely dismantled, its wires ripped from the wall and scattered across the floor in a chaotic tangle. The ranger was gone. There were no signs of a struggle, and more unsettlingly, there were no tracks leading away from the catwalk into the fresh snow. It was as if he had simply vanished into the freezing air. The official incident report blamed a catastrophic electrical failure and severe isolation psychosis, citing the dismantled radio as proof of a mental breakdown. But the logbooks from that week were never entered into the public record. And according to the locals who live near the edge of the park boundaries, if you tune a shortwave radio to the emergency frequency in the dead of winter, somewhere around 3 a.m., you can still hear it. The sound of wet breathing, heavy footsteps in the snow, and a voice trying to remember how to speak. The Pogo Clown's Crawlspace. The suburbs of Chicago in the 1970s were a portrait of American stability. Neatly paved streets, freshly painted fences, and the quiet assurance that hard work yielded a comfortable life. On Summerdale Avenue in Des Plaines, this ideal was embodied by a successful contractor. He was a precinct captain, a charismatic neighbor who threw lavish summer barbecues, and a man who volunteered his weekends to entertain sick children dressed as Pogo the Clown. But beneath the veneer of civic duty and neighborly warmth, beneath the very floorboards of his sprawling brick ranch house, a suffocating darkness was taking root. It did not begin with a sight or a sound. It began with a smell. At first, the odor was subtle. It was a heavy, damp presence that seemed to cling to the lower edges of the rooms. The contractor's wife would walk through her kitchen on a Tuesday afternoon and catch a faint, sickeningly sweet waft drifting up from the heating vents. It did not smell like common household garbage. It was an oily, thick scent, reminiscent of spoiled meat left too long in the sun, mixed with the chalky, bitter chemical tang of quicklime. It was the kind of smell that coats the back of the throat and settles deep in the lungs. When she questioned him, John Wayne Gacy remained perfectly calm. He did not flinch or grow defensive. With the smooth, reassuring cadence of a seasoned salesman, he offered logical explanations. The house was built on a high water table, he told her. It was simply moisture building up in the dark, unventilated earth of the crawlspace. Or perhaps, he suggested with a casual shrug, a stray cat or a rat had crawled under the foundation during a cold snap and died. To fix it, he hauled dozens of bags of powdered lime into the house, dragging them down the hallway to the small access hatch in the floor. The access hatch was a small, unassuming square of wood that led down into a claustrophobic nightmare. The crawlspace was not a basement. It was a tight, oppressive gap between the floor joists and the raw earth, offering only a few feet of clearance. A man could not stand down there. He had to crouch, dragging himself through the cold, damp mud on his hands and knees. In the absolute darkness of that cramped void, the air was entirely still, thick with the heat of decomposition. Over the years, Gacy descended into this lightless pocket of earth again and again, armed with a short-handled shovel. He carved shallow trenches into the soil, forcing limp, lifeless forms into spaces too small to hold them, folding limbs to make them fit, and burying them under a thick snowfall of corrosive lime. Above ground, the charade of normalcy continued, creating a grotesque juxtaposition that defied comprehension. In the height of summer, usually around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Gacy would host his legendary backyard barbecues. Hundreds of guests would arrive. There were local politicians, distinguished police officers, and successful business owners, all mingling under the warm afternoon sun. They drank cold beer, played horseshoes on the lawn, and laughed at Gacy's loud, boisterous jokes. Is less than hash-hone. Zero hash is greater than. Gacy would stand at the large outdoor grill wearing an apron, skillfully flipping burgers and steaks. The rich, savory smoke of cooking meat would billow across the yard, masking the faint, persistent odor rising from the ground below. As the guests stood on the patio, making small talk and enjoying the suburban twilight, they were completely oblivious. They were standing on a graveyard. Just inches below the soles of their expensive shoes, separated only by a thin layer of topsoil and concrete, lay the rotting remains of young men. 29 bodies were packed into the earth beneath the property, slowly dissolving into the mud while the party carried on above them. But as the years passed, the crawlspace grew crowded. The earth could no longer absorb the volume of the dead. By 1977, the sickening sweetness in the house became impossible to ignore. In the dead of winter, when the bitter Illinois wind forced the family to close all the windows and turn on the furnace, the horror amplified. The heating system acted as an exhaust pipe for the tomb below. The warm air pushed the concentrated, putrid stench of mass decay up through the floor registers, filling the bedrooms, the living room, and the kitchen with the undeniable smell of death. The scent permeated the furniture. It settled into the fabric of the curtains and the fibers of the carpets. The wife burned candles constantly, leaving windows cracked open despite the freezing temperatures, desperate to scrub the foulness from her home. Gacy brought in industrial deodorizers and fans, complaining loudly about the poor drainage system. He continued to pour hundreds of pounds of lime down the hatch. He maintained his mask of irritation, acting as the frustrated homeowner dealing with a stubborn structural issue. He would put on his clown makeup, paint a wide red smile over his face, and head out to parties, leaving his family to breathe in the exhalations of his victims. The claustrophobia of the house became psychological as well as physical. The air was thick, suffocating, and heavy with an unspoken dread. Neighbors began to notice the strange, pungent odor wafting from the property when the wind blew in a certain direction. They too accepted the story of the broken sump pump and the damp earth. No one wanted to believe that the cheerful man who fixed their sidewalks and hosted their block parties was capable of anything sinister. The human mind naturally rejects the unimaginable, preferring to believe in dead rats rather than murdered boys. The illusion finally collapsed in the freezing final days of 1978. Investigators, looking into the disappearance of a local teenager, executed a search warrant on the house at 8213 Summerdale. When a detective stood in the living room, feeling the warm air blow from a heating vent, the smell hit him. It was a scent no seasoned officer could mistake for a dead animal or a moisture problem. It was the distinct, unmistakable odor of human putrefaction. They pulled up the access panel. A technician lowered himself into the dark, incredibly tight space beneath the house. The heat down there was unnatural, generated by the chemical reaction of the lime and the biological process of dozens of bodies breaking down in the soil. As the technician swept away a thin layer of dirt and white powder, his trowel struck something hard. It was not a pipe, and it was not a stone. It was a human femur. What followed was a slow, agonizing excavation. The crawl space was so heavily packed with remains that investigators struggled to tell where one trench ended and another began. The earth was saturated. The claustrophobia of the site meant officers had to work in agonizingly cramped positions, breathing through heavy masks, carefully removing the victims one by one from the dark mud. They uncovered 29 bodies in that tight, airless void beneath the floorboards, a silent congregation trapped in the dark while the world walked above them. The house was eventually demolished, erased from the manicured landscape of Summerdale Avenue. The lot was left vacant, a patch of empty grass standing in stark contrast to the identical homes surrounding it. But the memory of that suffocating house remains a permanent scar on the neighborhood. For those who lived there, who attended the parties, and who breathed the air in that living room, the horror lingers. It is the realization of how thin the floorboards truly are, and how easily a monster can hide his darkness behind a painted smile and a neighborly wave, burying his secrets in the shallow earth while the rest of the world turns a blind eye. The Midnight Choir of Waverly Hills. On a high wooded ridge in southwestern Louisville, Kentucky, a decaying Gothic monolith bleeds into the night sky. Waverly Hills Sanatorium stands as a sprawling, bat-winged fortress of dark brick and shattered glass. The structure is massive, dominating the landscape with a heavy, oppressive stillness. It is a place where time ceased to move decades ago, yet the physical residue of immense human suffering never truly evaporated from its halls. The wind that pulls through the empty window frames does not merely whistle, it wheezes, dragging across the cracked plaster like breath through a ruined trachea. To understand the atmosphere of Waverly Hills is to understand the White Plague. In the early 20th century, tuberculosis was a death sentence that arrived as a slow, suffocating thief. By 1926, the massive 5-story sanatorium was opened to accommodate the overwhelming tide of the afflicted. It was designed as an island of quarantine, a place where the sick were sent to either recover through experimental fresh air therapies or, far more often, to die in isolation. Patients were subjected to brutal treatments, ribs were surgically removed to collapse infected lungs, and heavy sandbags were placed on chests. The sheer volume of mortality was staggering. It is estimated that up to 60,000 souls took their final, agonizing breaths within these walls. The bodies became so numerous that a motorized cable system was installed in a concrete tunnel stretching 400 feet down the hill. This became known as the body chute, a grim artery designed to transport the dead away quietly, out of sight of the living whose morale was already fracturing. Today, the building is a hollow shell, stripped of its medical equipment and abandoned to the elements. Yet, those who are tasked with walking its long, cavernous corridors at night understand that Waverly Hills is not empty. It is saturated. The caretakers and night guards who patrol the sprawling wards do not speak of traditional hauntings. They do not report transparent figures in period clothing. Instead, they describe a terrifying environmental playback, a phenomenon where the building itself seems to regurgitate the sensory horrors of its past. The auditory terror usually begins deep in the night, often reported around 2:30 a.m., when the ambient noise of the surrounding city has completely faded. A lone guard walking the central corridor of the fourth floor will first notice a severe drop in air pressure. The atmosphere grows heavy, thick with a metallic scent that closely resembles old dried copper. It is the distinct, unmistakable smell of blood. The temperature plummets rapidly, mimicking the cold, damp sweat of a breaking fever. Then, the silence is broken by a single, wet sound. It starts as a low, guttural click at the far end of the pitch-black hallway, a sharp intake of air followed by a wet, heavy cough. The sound is highly localized, echoing off the peeling lead paint and the chipped terrazzo floors. It sounds exactly like a human being struggling to clear a massive obstruction from their throat. Before the mind can rationalize the sound as a trick of the wind or settling pipes, a second cough joins in from an adjacent empty room. Then a third, emanating from the shadows directly behind the listener. Within moments, the isolated sounds cascade into a horrific symphony. It is a phenomenon known among the night staff as the midnight choir. Dozens, then hundreds of invisible throats begin to spasm simultaneously. It is the terrible, unmistakable sound of the death rattle, the final stage of respiratory failure, where fluid pools in the lungs and the failing throat loses its ability to swallow. The acoustics of the long, tiled corridors amplify the noise until it becomes a deafening roar. It is the sound of an entire hospital ward drowning on dry land. Caretakers have reported dropping to their knees, clutching their ears to block out the overwhelming auditory assault of hundreds of phantom patients choking on their own dissolving lungs. The noise vibrates in the sternum. It feels entirely physical, a crushing wave of collective agony that demands to be heard. It is during this crescendo of auditory panic that the visual terror manifests. The human brain, overwhelmed by the deafening sound of unseen suffocation, frantically commands the eyes to search for the source. The beam of a heavy flashlight cuts through the dust-moated air, sweeping wildly across the empty beds and the graffiti-stained walls. But the threat does not walk on the floor. High above, pressed flat against the decaying ceiling plaster, a shape detaches itself from the darkness. It is an entity known only in the whispered lore of the property as the Creeper. The flashlight beam reveals a sprawling, ink-black silhouette roughly the size of a human, but its proportions are entirely wrong. Its limbs are elongated, spindly, and bent at impossible spider-like angles. It defies gravity, clinging to the smooth ceiling above the hallway with an unnatural tension. The Creeper does not float. It crawls. It moves with the rapid, twitching locomotion of an insect, scuttling across the ceiling tiles at a terrifying speed. As the choir of choking patients echoes endlessly through the ward, the shadowed entity darts from archway to archway, using the deep corners of the high ceilings to mask its approach. It makes no sound of its own, fully concealed by the deafening roar of the phantom coughing. Witnesses describe a paralyzing sense of predatory intent radiating from the shape. It descends the walls only to reposition itself, moving so fast that the eye can barely track its progression before it melds back into the blackness above. It is a manifestation of pure, predatory dread, feeding off the residual energy of the suffering that permeates the brickwork. Those who encounter the midnight choir and the crawling shadow do not investigate further. The only rational response is retreat. Guards report backing away slowly, keeping their flashlight beams trained on the ceiling until they reach the heavy steel doors of the main stairwell. The descent down the concrete steps is always frantic, driven by the suffocating need to escape the heavy, diseased air of the upper floors. The sounds of the collective death rattle only begin to muffle once the heavy exterior doors are pushed open, allowing the freezing night air of the Kentucky woods to hit the face. But the silence outside never truly erases the experience. The trauma of the encounter lingers long after the shift ends. Those who walk the halls of Waverly Hills learn a grim reality about the nature of a haunting. The sanatorium is not simply a structure occupied by restless spirits. It is a massive architectural phonograph needle permanently stuck in the deepest groove of human agony, playing back the horrific reality of the White Plague to anyone unfortunate enough to listen in the dark. A Yellowstone report from 2012 was never filed. The smell was the first thing that confirmed something was terribly wrong in the clearing, a heavy scent of scorched copper and sulfur that hung unnaturally still in the cold mountain air. Elias, a seasoned backcountry ranger, stood at the edge of the tree line and stared at what remained of the Geological Survey camp. The campsite was located deep within the Thoroughfare region of Yellowstone, a massive expanse of wilderness widely considered the most remote area in the lower 48 states. It was late October of 2012, and the three-person survey team was officially 4 days overdue. Elias had hiked for 2 days through dense pine forests and over jagged ridges to reach their last known coordinates. He had expected to find a twisted ankle, a broken radio, or perhaps a group of researchers simply running behind schedule. Instead, he found absolute silence and a scene that defied all logic. The large dome tent sat in the center of the clearing, but it had not been collapsed by wind or torn by a grizzly bear. The bright orange nylon was entirely melted, fused together into a hard, glossy shell that reflected the gray afternoon light. The damage did not look like the result of a campfire gone out of control. There was no ash, no charred wood, and the dry yellow grass surrounding the tent was perfectly untouched. It looked as though an intense, localized heat source had baked the tent from the inside out, causing the synthetic material to shrink and petrify around the aluminum poles. The poles themselves were warped inward, bent as if subjected to immense and sudden atmospheric pressure. Elias did not call out. The profound quiet of the forest seemed to press against his ears, and an instinct older than his training told him to remain completely silent. He approached the petrified structure slowly, his boots crunching lightly on the frost-hardened dirt. He unholstered his bear spray, though he already knew that no animal was responsible for this. Peering through a melted gap in the nylon, he saw the 3 sleeping bags. They were empty, but they were compressed, flattened against the floor of the tent as if smoothed down by a heavy weight. There were no backpacks, no boots, and no sign of the expensive thermal imaging equipment the team had brought with them. The only item left behind was a small green field journal lying in the dirt near the fire ring. Elias picked it up. The cover was warm to the touch, despite the ambient temperature hovering near 30 degrees. He opened the journal. The first dozen pages were filled with standard scientific notations, neatly written columns detailing soil acidity, water temperatures, and seismic readings from the nearby thermal vents. But as he turned the pages, the handwriting began to deteriorate. The neat columns gave way to sprawling, erratic sentences that pushed off the edges of the paper. The entries from 3 days prior stopped mentioning geology entirely. Instead, the lead researcher had written repeatedly about a low, vibrating hum that seemed to emanate not from the ground, but from the empty spaces between the trees. The final entry, written in a frantic, pressing hand, consisted of only one sentence. It read, "The shadows are unlatching from the pines, and they do not cast themselves on the ground." Elias felt a cold prickle of sweat form at the base of his neck. He reached for his shoulder radio, keying the microphone to contact the dispatch center at Mammoth Hot Springs. He spoke softly, identifying himself and requesting an immediate emergency channel. He waited for the familiar burst of static and the dispatcher's voice. Instead, the radio emitted a sound he had never heard before. It was a wet, rhythmic tearing noise, followed by a slow, dragging exhalation that sounded impossibly close. It did not sound like signal interference. It sounded like something breathing directly into a microphone in a hollow, echoing room. Elias released the button, his heart hammering against his ribs. He tried again. The same slow, ragged breath answered him, but this time he could hear a faint clicking noise in the background, like teeth snapping together in the dark. He turned the radio off completely. The air in the clearing felt suddenly heavy, as if the barometric pressure had plummeted in a matter of seconds. The sky above the canopy shifted from a pale, overcast gray to a bruised, unnatural purple. A light snow began to fall, but as a flake landed on the sleeve of his green uniform, Elias realized it was not snow. It was fine, pale ash. There were no active forest fires anywhere in the region, and the nearest thermal geyser capable of producing such debris was over 20 miles away. The ash fell silently, coating the melted tent and the silent clearing in a thin layer of gray dust. Elias knew he had to leave. He had a patrol cabin waiting for him about 4 miles south, a sturdy log structure with heavy iron locks and a wood stove. He placed the journal into his waterproof pouch, turned his back on the campsite, and began to walk. The hike to the cabin took 2 hours, and the entire way, Elias could not shake the feeling of being paced. He heard no twigs snap, no heavy footsteps in the underbrush, but the woods were entirely devoid of wildlife. Not a single squirrel chattered, and no birds called from the high branches. The silence was oppressive, heavy enough to make his ears ring. Every time he stopped to check his compass, he felt a strange, cold pressure on the back of his neck, the distinct sensation of being observed by something that understood exactly what he was doing. When the small, dark shape of the Thorofar patrol cabin finally appeared through the trees, Elias felt a wave of relief so intense it made his knees weak. He unlocked the heavy wooden door, stepped inside, and immediately threw the deadbolt. He pulled the thick iron shutters across the 2 small windows, plunging the single-room cabin into darkness. He used his flashlight to find the woodpile in the corner and quickly built a fire in the cast-iron stove. The fire caught, but the flames burned with a strange pale blue hue, casting long, twisting shadows against the log walls. Elias sat in the only chair, his radio turned off, the heavy quiet of the cabin wrapping around him. He ate a cold ration bar and tried to rationalize what he had seen. A freak lightning strike, anomalous geothermal activity, a collective psychological break among the survey team. He repeated these theories to himself, trying to build a wall of logic against the creeping dread in his stomach. Night fell completely. The temperature outside plummeted to the single digits, and the logs of the cabin began to groan and pop in the extreme cold. It was near midnight when the silence was finally broken. The radio, which Elias had securely clipped to his tactical vest and powered down hours ago, suddenly crackled to life on its own. The green indicator light flickered in the dim room. A voice began to speak through the speaker. It was not the dispatcher. It was Elias's own voice, recorded from his earlier attempt to call for help. He heard himself say, "Yellowstone Dispatch, this is Thorofar Patrol." But the audio was distorted. It was slowed down, dragged out into a deep, guttural drawl, and underneath his own words, he could hear that same wet, rhythmic breathing. The playback looped 3 times, growing slightly louder with each repetition before cutting off into dead silence. Elias did not move. He sat frozen in the chair, his eyes locked on the radio. Then, a sound came from outside. It was not the wind. It was a soft, heavy thud against the exterior wall of the cabin, about 10 feet away from the door. It sounded like a wet sack of flour being dropped against the wood. A few seconds later, another thud hit the wall, this one higher up, near the roofline. Then came a sound that made his blood run cold. It was a scratching noise, slow and deliberate, dragging along the logs toward the shuttered window. It did not sound like claws. It sounded like bare, rigid fingers scraping against the timber. Driven by a terrifying compulsion he could not explain, Elias stood up and walked silently to the window. His hand trembled as he gripped the iron latch of the shutter. He opened it just a fraction of an inch, creating a tiny slit to peer out into the clearing. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, but the pale ash covering the ground provided a faint, ghostly illumination. Standing at the edge of the tree line, about 50 yards away, were 3 figures. They were wearing the bright yellow and gray winter parkas of the missing geological team. But they were not acting like lost hikers. They were standing perfectly still, shoulder to shoulder, facing away from the cabin. Their heads were tilted back at an extreme, impossible angle, staring straight up into the pitch-black sky. They did not shiver in the freezing wind. They did not move a single muscle. Elias watched them for what felt like hours, unable to look away, until the pale light of dawn finally began to bleed over the horizon. When the sun broke through the clouds, the figures were gone. Elias waited until mid-morning before unbarring the door. He stepped outside, his rifle gripped tightly in his hands. He walked to the edge of the tree line where the figures had stood. The layer of frost and pale ash was completely undisturbed. There were no footprints leading into the clearing, and none leading away. It was as if they had simply ceased to exist when the light touched them. Elias packed his gear, locked the cabin, and began the brutal 30-mile hike back to civilization. He did not stop to rest, and he did not turn on his radio again. 2 days later, Elias sat in a brightly lit, windowless office at the park headquarters in Mammoth Hot Springs. He sat across from his sector supervisor, a stern man who listened quietly as Elias recounted every detail of the melted tent, the ash, the journal, and the figures in the dark. When Elias finished, he placed the small green journal on the desk. The supervisor stared at it for a long time, then reached into a drawer and pulled out a manila folder. The supervisor pushed the folder across the desk. He spoke in a flat, bureaucratic tone, stating that the geological survey team had emerged safely from the south entrance of the park 3 days prior. They had reported a minor equipment failure and decided to cut their expedition short. Elias opened the folder. Inside was a checkout log from the south entrance gate. It listed 3 names, complete with signatures and vehicle plate numbers. But as Elias read the names, a cold knot formed in his chest. The names on the checkout sheet did not match the names of the researchers he had been sent to find. He looked up at his supervisor, pointing out the discrepancy. The supervisor simply picked up the green journal, placed it into a heavy gray lockbox behind his desk, and told Elias that altitude sickness and isolation often cause severe auditory and visual hallucinations. He advised Elias to take a mandatory 2 weeks of paid leave, heavily implying that any further discussion of the incident would result in a permanent psychological discharge. Elias took the leave, and shortly after, requested a transfer to a different park entirely. He never returned to the thoroughfare. His detailed handwritten report was never entered into the digital database. If you search the public records for a missing geological team in the fall of 2012, you will find absolutely nothing. But among the veteran backcountry rangers of Yellowstone, a quiet rumor still circulates. They say that if you find yourself near the thermal vents of the deep thoroughfare late in the season and the temperature suddenly drops, you should never look out the windows of the patrol cabins. They say that sometimes, when the sky turns purple and the ash falls, you can still hear the static on the emergency channels playing back a slowed, distorted voice, accompanied by the sound of wet, rhythmic breathing. In the Nahanni Valley, locals still avoid one section of the river. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police Patrol found the camp at twilight, nestled in a deep, shadowed bend of the South Nahanni River. It was the autumn of 1908. The fire ring had been cold for weeks, the ashes washed flat by heavy rains, supplies were stacked neatly beside a thick canvas tent, sacks of flour and dried beans sat entirely untouched, while expensive gold prospecting equipment was laid out methodically in the damp moss. But what caused the officers to draw their rifles and step back into the shadows was not the abandoned gear, it was the shape lying just beyond the tree line. Wrapped in heavy winter furs, the body of a man was strapped tightly to a wooden sled. His hands were securely bound, and his head was entirely missing. This discovery would become the first official record of a mystery that would stain the remote Canadian wilderness for over a century. The Nahanni River carves a violent path through the Northwest Territories, surrounded by limestone walls that rise thousands of feet into the sky. It is a place of staggering beauty and extreme hostility. Deep within the canyons, geothermal hot springs heat the frozen earth, creating bizarre tropical microclimates where rare plants bloom in the dead of winter. Thick, sulfurous white fog constantly bleeds from these vents, rolling across the forest floor and swallowing the landscape in an impenetrable veil. To the indigenous Dene people who have lived on the borders of this wilderness for thousands of years, the valley was not a place of refuge. It was a place to be avoided at all costs. The body found tied to the sled belonged to one of the McLeod brothers, Willie and Frank, two prospectors who had ventured into the canyon 3 years earlier in search of a legendary lost gold mine. According to reports, the brothers had ignored the warnings of local guides who spoke of an evil presence dwelling deep within the mist. When the search party eventually located the second brother a short distance from the camp, his remains mirrored the first. His head was also gone. Police reports from the time noted that the camp showed no signs of a struggle. There were no scattered belongings, no torn canvas, and no defensive wounds on the bodies. It was as if whatever had come for them had done so with calm, methodical precision. Investigators initially blamed the grim condition of the bodies on scavenging animals, suggesting that bears or wolves had carried off the skulls. But seasoned trappers in the region pointed out the terrifying inconsistencies in this theory. Animals do not bind a man's hands. They do not strap a body to a sled. And scavengers do not selectively remove a human head while leaving the rest of the body, along with the camp's entire food supply, completely untouched. A deep unease settled over the local trading posts. The area quickly earned a dark nickname among prospectors and trappers, a name it still holds today. They called it the Valley of the Headless Men. For nearly a decade, the canyons remained largely empty. The harsh winters and the lingering fear kept most outsiders away, but the lure of untouched gold is a powerful force. In 1917, a rugged Swiss prospector named Martin Jorgensen decided to test his luck in the valley. He was an experienced woodsman, well-equipped to handle the brutal subarctic conditions. For months, he seemed to thrive. He built a sturdy log cabin near the riverbank, occasionally sending word back to civilization that he had struck a rich vein of gold. He wrote that he had found his fortune and that he planned to stay in the valley until the following spring. But spring came and Jorgensen never emerged from the canyon. A group of travelers passing through the area noticed a column of dark smoke rising from the deep woods. When they investigated, they found Jorgensen's cabin burned to its stone foundations. The heavy logs had been reduced to smoldering embers. Among the ashes, they discovered his skeleton. His rifle was found a few feet away, fully loaded and unfired. And just like the McLeod brothers before him, Jorgensen's skull was nowhere to be found. The gold he had claimed to discover was missing entirely. The silence that surrounded the burned cabin offered no clues. There were no tracks leading away from the ruins, only the quiet rush of the Nahanni River echoing off the canyon walls. The pattern was too specific to ignore. Rumors began to spread wildly through the Northern Territories. Some believed that a hostile, uncontacted tribe lived deep in the mountains, violently protecting the valley's gold. Others whispered about the Naha, a mythical, fierce tribe from local folklore that was said to dwell in the high peaks, descending only to slaughter those who trespassed. But the indigenous guides insisted the Naha had vanished without a trace centuries ago. The elders warned that the threat in the valley was not a tribe of men. They spoke of evil spirits, of massive creatures that walked upright in the fog, and of an ancient sickness that infected the very soil of the canyon. Despite the grim history, the valley claimed another victim in 1945. An Ontario miner named Ernest Savard was found dead near his camp in the same region. His body was discovered inside his heavy sleeping bag, zipped up tightly against the freezing night air. He had not been burned, nor had he been bound, but the result was the same. His head had been cleanly removed, and it was missing from the campsite. The police investigation concluded with no suspects and no explanation. The sheer isolation of the area made it impossible to secure a crime scene or track down leads. Whoever or whatever was responsible for the mutilations had thousands of square miles of dense, unforgiving wilderness to hide in. By the late 1960s, the era of the lone gold prospector had largely ended, replaced by organized expeditions and recreational adventurers. A group of 4 experienced outdoorsmen traveled to the valley, determined to navigate the treacherous rapids of the Nahanni River. They were well aware of the legends, viewing them as campfire ghost stories meant to scare away tourists. They set up camp on a wide gravel riverbank, surrounded by towering spruce trees and the ever-present sulfur mist from the nearby hot springs. The evening was uneventful. They cooked their food, secured their supplies in bear-proof containers, and retired to their individual tents as the temperature plummeted. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, one of the men awoke to a strange sensation. He later described it to authorities as a feeling of immense atmospheric pressure, a sudden heaviness in the air that made it difficult to breathe. The ambient noise of the wilderness had completely vanished. The wind had stopped howling through the canyon. Even the rushing sound of the river seemed muffled, as if wrapped in thick cotton. He lay awake in his sleeping bag, listening intently to the unnatural silence. Then he heard a sound that made his blood run cold. It was a heavy, wet, dragging noise, moving slowly over the smooth river stones just outside his tent. It sounded like a massive wet sack being pulled across the gravel. The dragging was accompanied by a low, rhythmic thud, like the footsteps of something unbelievably heavy. The man held his breath, clutching his hunting knife, too paralyzed by fear to unzip his tent. The dragging sound stopped right beside the thin nylon wall of his shelter. He could hear a deep, ragged exhalation, a breathing so loud and guttural it vibrated in his chest. A foul stench leaked into the tent, smelling of rotten meat and stagnant swamp water. The creature, or person, stood there in the absolute dark for what felt like an eternity. Then, the heavy footsteps slowly moved away, retreating toward the edge of the forest. The man did not sleep the rest of the night. He lay frozen, waiting for the sun to rise. When dawn finally broke, casting a pale gray light through the mist, he emerged from his tent. The camp looked completely normal. The bear-proof containers were untouched, the fire pit was undisturbed. But when he looked toward the tent of his friend, who had been sleeping closest to the tree line, he noticed the flap was hanging wide open. He walked over and looked inside. His friend was gone. His heavy hiking boots were still sitting neatly by the entrance, his winter coat was draped over his backpack, but his sleeping bag and the man inside it had vanished. The remaining 3 men desperately searched the perimeter of the camp. Near the edge of the dense spruce trees, they found a wide path of crushed vegetation, as if something incredibly heavy had been dragged directly into the forest. They followed the trail for nearly a mile, shouting their friend's name into the thick, sulphurous fog. They received no answer. The tracks eventually disappeared at the edge of a sheer cliff face, dropping hundreds of feet into a jagged ravine. Hanging from a branch near the edge, nearly 10 feet off the ground, they found a torn, bloody piece of a nylon sleeping bag. A massive search operation was launched in the following days. Search and rescue teams scoured the canyon, utilizing helicopters and tracker dogs. The dogs were brought to the edge of the woods where the sleeping bag was found, but according to the handlers, the animals panicked. They whined, tucked their tails, and absolutely refused to enter the tree line. The search lasted for 2 weeks, but not a single trace of the missing camper was ever found. He was eventually declared dead, another tragic victim of the unforgiving Nahanni wilderness. The official report cited an animal attack, likely a massive grizzly bear, though no bear tracks were ever identified near the camp. Over the years, strange reports have continued to leak out of the valley. Pilots flying small float planes low over the canyons have reported experiencing sudden, inexplicable compass failures and electrical malfunctions. Some have sworn they saw massive, dark silhouettes standing entirely still in the fog, figures that looked vaguely human but were far too large. Hikers who stray too close to the hot springs often report the sudden, overpowering stench of rotting meat, followed by the distinct sound of heavy, bipedal footsteps shadowing them from just out of sight. The feeling of being hunted is so intense that many turn back before completing their journey. Today, the Nahanni National Park Reserve is a protected area. Visitors are strictly regulated, and deep ventures into the canyons require specialized permits. Park rangers warn every group to stick together, to keep their campsites clean, and to never wander away from the firelight alone. But despite modern equipment, satellite phones, and global positioning systems, the valley remains an isolated, silent world of its own. The steep limestone walls block communication signals, and the sudden, violent weather changes can ground rescue helicopters for days. If you find yourself in trouble out there, you are entirely on your own. Some investigators still believe there is a rational explanation for the history of severed heads and vanished campers. They point to the extreme psychological toll of total isolation, suggesting that cabin fever or mercury poisoning from mining operations drove men to murder each other in gruesome ways. They argue that scavengers simply finished the job, carrying away the skulls. But these logical theories provide little comfort to those who have actually stood in the deep shadows of the canyon, listening to the wind howl through the rocks, watching the thick white fog pour out of the earth. The mystery of the valley remains a dark, open wound in the history of the Canadian North. The remains of Willie and Frank McLeod, Martin Jorgensen, and Ernest Savard were eventually buried, their case files gathering dust in forgotten archives. The gold they were searching for was never recovered. The indigenous locals continue to pass down the ancient warnings, refusing to camp near the haunted sections of the river. They know that the sheer, towering walls of the canyon keep secrets hidden perfectly in the dark. There is a stretch of the South Nahanni River where the water grows strangely calm, and the sulfur mist hangs so thick you cannot see the opposite bank. The silence there is heavy, almost suffocating, broken only by the occasional sound of rocks tumbling down the distant cliffs. If you stand by the water's edge at twilight, when the shadows stretch long across the gravel, you might hear a low, wet, dragging sound coming from the trees. According to those who know the legends, it is best not to turn your flashlight toward the noise. Whatever took the heads of the prospectors over a century ago never left the valley. It is still out there, hiding in the fog, waiting patiently for the fire to burn out. A Northern California cabin had a door that opened from inside. The sound was unmistakable. It was the heavy, metallic thud of a steel deadbolt sliding into place, followed by the definitive click of the locking mechanism. Thomas stood motionless on the rotting wooden porch, the freezing rain dripping from the brim of his hat. He was entirely alone, 20 miles from the nearest paved road. He stared at the weathered oak door of the cabin. His own right hand was still holding the brass key, having just secured the exterior padlock seconds ago. Yet, someone or something inside the dark, windowless cabin had just thrown the inner latch, effectively locking him out. It was late November of 1996. The isolated parcel of land sat deep within the ancient, dripping forests of Mendocino County. Thomas was a county appraiser tasked with evaluating the abandoned estate of a man named Arthur Vance. According to local records, Vance had walked away from his property 6 years earlier, driving to the county sheriff's office and handing over a ring of heavy iron keys. The man had refused to speak of the cabin, only stating that the property was no longer his and that no one should ever go back there after sundown. The journey to the property that morning had been an exercise in isolation. As Thomas had navigated his truck off the main highway and onto the unmarked dirt logging roads, the towering redwoods had seemed to close in around him, their massive trunks blocking out the pale autumn sunlight. The local radio station had dissolved into a haze of white static miles ago. The deeper he drove into the forested hills, the quieter the world became. By the time he reached the rusted iron gate marking the property line, the silence was almost deafening, broken only by the steady drum of rain against his windshield. Thomas had heard the rumors, of course. Small towns always held on to stories of eccentric hermits and cursed land, but Thomas was a man of measurements, property lines, and tax codes. He had arrived at the cabin at 2 p.m, armed with a clipboard and a heavy flashlight. The structure itself was an anomaly. It was built from massive, untreated pine logs, but it completely lacked windows. The only point of entry was the single, solid oak door at the front, reinforced with thick iron bands and fitted with an absurd number of locks on both the inside and the outside. When Thomas had first unlocked the door and stepped inside earlier that afternoon, the air had tasted stale, metallic, and incredibly heavy. His flashlight beam had cut through thick, suspended dust, revealing a single, massive room. There was no furniture, there was no stove. There were only bare wooden floorboards sloping inexplicably toward the exact center of the room. In the corners, thousands of dead, desiccated flies were swept into neat, deliberate piles. The atmosphere had been so intensely oppressive that Thomas had found it difficult to draw a full breath, as if the room itself was actively rejecting his presence. By 4:30 p.m., the pale winter sun had dipped behind the towering redwoods, plunging the forest into a deep, premature twilight. A heavy, freezing rain had begun to fall. Thomas had decided to end his inspection early, eager to escape the suffocating air of the cabin. He had stepped out onto the porch, pulled the heavy oak door shut, and threaded a thick steel chain through the exterior iron hasps, securing it with a heavy brass padlock. He had turned the key, satisfied that the structure was completely sealed. And that was when he heard it. The unmistakable sound of the interior deadbolt sliding shut. Thomas stood on the porch, his hand resting on the wet iron chain. He leaned his ear against the damp wood of the door. He held his breath, straining to hear any movement from within. There was only silence, the heavy, dead silence of an empty room. He stepped back slowly, the rain plastering his hair to his forehead. There was no other way into the structure. No windows, no cellar doors, no gaps in the heavy log roof. Whatever had thrown that deadbolt was trapped inside. Or, Thomas thought with a sudden chill, it had simply wanted to ensure that Thomas stayed outside. He slowly backed down the wooden steps, his boots sinking into the muddy ground, keeping his eyes fixed on the blank wooden door until he reached the safety of his truck. Thomas climbed into the cab, locking the doors and turning the ignition just enough to run the heater. The digital clock on the dashboard read 5:15 p.m. He wiped the condensation from the inside of the windshield, peering through the driving rain at the dark shape of the cabin. The wind picked up, violently thrashing the branches of the surrounding pines, but the cabin stood immovable, a black void against the gray trees. Hours dragged by in agonizing slowness. The rain transitioned into a steady, freezing mist. By midnight, Thomas had managed to drift into a shallow, uneasy sleep, his head resting against the cold glass of the driver's side window. He was awakened abruptly by a sound that cut cleanly through the white noise of the weather. It was a low, rhythmic thud. It sounded like heavy, deliberate footsteps pacing back and forth across the hollow floorboards of the cabin. Thomas sat up slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs. He looked toward the structure. It was barely visible in the heavy fog that had rolled in from the coast. The thudding continued. 4 steps in one direction. A pause. 4 steps back. The sound was immense, carrying a weight that seemed far too heavy for a human being. The thick floorboards inside creaked and groaned in protest with every single step. His trembling hand reached for the headlight switch. He pulled it. The high beams violently illuminated the clearing, casting stark, shifting shadows against the front of the cabin. The instant the harsh yellow light struck the weathered wood of the door, the pacing stopped entirely. The silence that followed was immediate, unnatural, and suffocating. Thomas stared at the heavy door, watching the fog drift through the beams of light. For 10 long minutes, absolutely nothing happened. He considered putting the truck in gear and driving back down the muddy access road, abandoning the assessment entirely. But the twisting, unpaved logging road was treacherous in the daylight and practically a death trap in a freezing midnight fog. He had no choice but to sit in the cold truck and wait for morning. He reached out and pushed the headlight switch back in. The clearing plunged into absolute darkness once more. Almost immediately, the brass doorknob of the cabin began to rattle. Thomas could hear it clearly over the howling wind. The knob was turning frantically, twisting left and right as if unseen hands were violently shaking it. Then came the sound of heavy fists hammering against the inside of the wood, a frantic, desperate pounding that shook the entire frame of the building. According to the official county records filed weeks later, the physical mechanics of what happened next were entirely impossible. The cabin door was constructed to swing inward. It rested against a thick, load-bearing wooden frame that prevented it from opening outward under any circumstances. Furthermore, Thomas had secured the outside with a heavy steel chain, and the interior deadbolt was firmly locked in place. The heavy thudding against the wood suddenly changed into a steady, agonizing groan. Thomas turned the headlights back on, his hands shaking violently. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. The heavy oak door was bowing outward. It was curving toward the porch under the strain of an immense, unseen pressure from within. The thick iron hinges were screaming in the cold air, the metal bending as the solid wood was pushed slowly, impossibly, in the completely wrong direction. The steel chain Thomas had wrapped around the exterior hasps pulled taut, grinding against the rusted iron. The door continued to bulge outward, the wood splintering along the center seam. Thomas watched, paralyzed by a deep, primal terror, as the heavy frame of the cabin began to crack under the strain. The sound of rending wood echoed through the dark forest, loud and sharp like cannon fire. With a deafening snap, the interior deadbolt sheared completely off its mountings. A second later, the exterior steel chain exploded, the padlock tearing cleanly through the rusted iron hasp. The heavy oak door burst violently outward, ripping entirely free from its twisted hinges and crashing down onto the wet wooden porch with a massive thud. Thomas slammed his back against the driver's seat, his eyes wide, waiting for whatever had been inside to emerge into the harsh light of his high beams. He stared at the gaping black rectangle of the doorway. The interior of the cabin was an impenetrable well of darkness, a void that seemed to swallow the light from his truck. He waited for a shape, a shadow, a movement. He waited for hours. Nothing ever came out. The rest of the night passed in a state of suspended terror. Thomas did not lower his eyes from the open doorway. He did not turn off the headlights until the battery began to die. As the first gray light of morning finally began to bleed through the canopy of the redwoods, the thick fog slowly dissipated. The forest was entirely still. The cabin stood silent in the pale morning light, its front torn open like a jagged wound. Sometime around 8 in the morning, Thomas finally found the strength to unlock his truck door. His legs were completely numb as he walked slowly across the muddy clearing toward the porch. He stepped over the shattered remains of the heavy steel chain, the brass padlock lying mangled in the dirt. He slowly approached the porch and looked down at the heavy oak door lying on the wet wood. The exterior of the door was battered and weathered from decades of exposure to the elements, but as Thomas carefully stepped over it to look at the interior side, his blood ran completely cold. The inside of the door was completely smooth. There were no scratch marks, there were no dents, there was absolutely no evidence that anything had struck, pushed, or hammered against the wood from the inside. The heavy iron latch of the deadbolt was still fully extended, having been snapped off by sheer blunt force. Trembling, Thomas raised his heavy flashlight and aimed it into the open doorway of the cabin. The pale beam swept across the bare, slanting floorboards. The neat piles of dead flies in the corners were completely undisturbed. But what haunted Thomas, and what would eventually force him to abandon his career entirely, was the dust. The thick gray layer of dust coating the floor of the cabin was perfectly even, pristine, and entirely unbroken. Not a single footprint marked the floor. Nothing had walked across the room to slide the deadbolt shut the evening before. Nothing had paced back and forth in the darkness during the night. And nothing had pressed against the heavy oak door to force it open. The structure had simply locked itself, held its breath in the dark, and then violently torn itself open from the inside out. Local residents still refused to hunt in that specific section of the Mendocino woods. The abandoned property remains entirely unsold. According to local hunters, who occasionally wander too close to the property line, the cabin is still standing, slowly rotting away into the forest floor. They say that on quiet winter nights, if you stand near the rusted iron gate, You can hear the distinct sound of heavy, dragging footsteps pacing back and forth in the darkness, waiting patiently for someone to bring a new door and try to lock it again.